mother when I was your age. She was a little spitfire, that woman. Not unlike your own mother, I suppose. If you don't mind divulging, though you don't have to of course, what did you fight about? Blowing a stray curl out of her eyes, Genevieve debated telling her. Her request had indeed been unorthodox. She was almost as surprised by her sudden courage as the men had looked. Dragon training had strictly been intended for men only. But she honestly wondered if the alternative had even been considered. Traditional as the Jatans were, young women trained to be housewives. That was their duty. Was it wrong to want more? I like learning new things, Genevieve said carefully. And with all the changes to our community going on, it's difficult for me to watch from the sidelines. She watched Rosa's expression tighten ever so slightly. Somehow I'm not surprised, Rosa said with a slow, wan smile. You asked if you could train, didn't you? I don't suppose your mother was happy. No, Genevieve chuckled with relief. I might have thrown a stick into Finn's plans. Rosa blinked. Whatever do you mean? You asked in front of the Haddocks, did you? Wincing, Genevieve nodded. Oh dear. I didn't mean to, it just slipped out. They were discussing what to do about that shockjaw. Dear me, you didn't volunteer to train that rabid beast. Rosa exclaimed. He's not rabid, he's afraid. There's a difference. Hiccup says that dragons are really kind and gentle creatures so long as you earn their trust. No one has earned his trust, so of course he's going to be angry about being locked in a cage for weeks on end. Rosa's grey-blue eyes were firm. Dear. Genevieve stood, drinking the last of her tea. I should go, old Tom is expecting me. Genevieve. She paused in the doorway, waiting for the rebuke. She was a young woman, dragon training was not in her repertoire. Perhaps you should speak to your parents about it if you feel so strongly. But I would advise against the shockjaw. That is a vicious creature that could have killed the Dragon Master's son just yesterday. There are always more dragons. Genevieve nodded and continued on her way. She knew the danger. She'd been awake for half the night, reliving the scene in the arena. When the shockjaw has hit Finn in the face, she'd flinched. When he staggered back and it charged, nearly crushing him against the wall, seeing Hiccup and the others panic. For a fleeting moment she'd almost wondered if the beast would kill him. Finn was one of the most professional riders Burke had. He should have sensed the attack coming. That's what many Jatans had been saying last night at dinner. But she wasn't convinced. She didn't doubt Finn's abilities, they all had underestimated the shockjaw's cunning, even Hiccup. Well, hopefully he could get through to the dragon before he returned to Burke. Then they could find someone to train it. She tried to push away the pang of jealousy, knowing she'd never get the chance. She didn't know why she even wanted a chance to train it. She didn't know anything about dragons, only what she'd learned in the last few weeks. She felt bad for the creature though. It had been locked up for weeks, barely eating, hardly seeing the sky. He hadn't been able to fly much. How depressing must it be to be held captive? To not be able to decide what his future might hold. Perhaps he'd even scorn her if given the chance. Maybe it was better to just let the beast go free. To let him decide if he should go or stay. Pausing, Genevieve realized that her story wasn't all too different from his. Shaking her head, she took the stairs quickly and was soon standing in front of old Tom's door. She pushed aside the flurry of emotions building in her chest with a steady exhale. She had to stop all these dreams of grandeur and now comparing her life to that of a dragon's. Until she married and had her own family, helping the elderly was her choice. She could choose what to do with her free time for now. But some things were out of her control and she had no choice. She had best stop wallowing about it and accept it. She pushed the door open and forced a smile onto her face as she greeted the old man in the bed. Good morning, Tom. Finn didn't know what magic his father possessed, but he dearly hoped it was hereditary. The male shockjaw sat in the center of the arena with a flat, sullen expression, but his hackles weren't raised. No claws, no fangs, not so much of a growl since Finn had arrived. His dad explained what had taken place and Finn had slowly come inside the arena, expecting the dragon to pitch a fit. Instead he'd merely glowered at Finn before turning away and stoically ignoring him. Eric had received only a slightly better response. The Shockjaw had sniffed his hand and looked away, though Finn could have sworn the dragon rolled his eyes as he did. Ivan and Kiev also gave it a shot and didn't fare much better, but no one was complaining. The fact that the dragon was calm and not so much as growling at anyone was progress. Hiccup had instructed everyone to stay relaxed and carry on as normal to not create a stressful environment. But after 3 hours of doing almost nothing, mainly organizing his training tools and rereading his notes, Finn was starting to get bored and antsy. None of the trainees could visit the arena today. He considered stopping by some of their homes to check their progress but pushed the thought away. He didn't want to be annoying, and truthfully, it was better if the trainees figured things out on their own and came to him for questions, not the other way around. But of course that didn't stop his ever-increasing sense of boredom. He'd been sitting on the hard stone floor against the wall for the better part of an hour when he was pleasantly surprised by a change of scenery. Genevieve halted at the entrance, her dark eyes wide and lips formed in a perfect O. "He's calm," she exclaimed. Grinning, she added, "I have to admit, Hiccup, I had my doubts." "Practice makes progress," Hiccup merely replied. Kiev frowned. "Jenny, we've been turning people away all day. We need a quiet environment." Without warning, the Shockjaw stood and walked toward her, sniffing the air as he went. Kiev made a noise of displeasure, but Finn was already moving. Rolling to his feet, he stepped between Genevieve and the dragon before he could get close. "Don't you think it's a little soon to be introduced to pretty girls? With your attitude, it will take more than a few hours to change your behavior." The Shockjaw halted, eyes leaving Genevieve to focus on him. Finn felt the disdain in the dragon's gaze and, for the first time that day, he felt the shift in the air. The dragon's upper lip began to curl and Finn took a step backwards, closer to Genevieve. If the dragon decided to pounce, he wouldn't allow her to be hurt. Suddenly, Hiccup was there, stepping between them all. "Hey now, remember what we talked about?" Hiccup said gently. With a hand behind his back, he waved at Finn to back further away. Finn was slightly surprised when she rested a gentle hand between his shoulder blades when he stepped closer to her. "If you can be nice to everyone, then you don't have to be in the cage, remember." The Shockjaw huffed and sat back on his haunches, shooting another look of disdain at Finn. Indignation rose up in Finn's chest. No dragon had ever looked at him like that before, as if he was some unwanted bug on the wall that needed to be squished. Exhaling through his nose, he faced Genevieve and she dropped her hand. He felt like he could still feel the press her palm even after the warmth disappeared into the cold. She was staring at the dragon in wonder, oblivious to his mixed emotions. He really is the dragon master. This one's a tough case, even for him. Finn crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. He tried not to be frustrated at the dragon, but he didn't know what he'd done to deserve his distaste. The Shockjaw was still staring at Genevieve but closed his eyes and purred when Hiccup scratched his neck below the chin. "Like a giant house cat," Genevieve murmured. Finn grunted in agreement but refrained from adding anything snooky. He and the male Shockjaw would be working together once his father left. He needed to stay on the dragon's good side. They didn't need a repeat of yesterday's fiasco, and though he hated to admit it, he'd been lucky. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to ward off another attack like that. While he'd woken with only a dull headache, his side had throbbed dimly throughout the day. If Mara or his mother knew, they'd probably force him into a chair for the remainder of the day. Keen as his father was, Finn was almost positive Hiccup had figured it out. He hoped his dad hadn't been keeping him in the arena doing nothing all day because of it. "Are you all right?" Finn met Genevieve's eyes, noting her concerned look. "I'm fine." "Why? You look frustrated." "Well, it's not every day I meet someone who doesn't love me." Finn gestured to the Shockjaw, whose lip curled. Genevieve scoffed in amusement. "Right." Hiccup patted the dragon's shoulder with a few hearty slaps. "Finally someone who doesn't want to deal with your nonsense. Now the real problem is getting him to eat." "He still hasn't eaten?" Genevieve asked in surprise. Finn felt a mixture of relief and guilt that she'd fallen for his excuse. "Why?" "He doesn't trust us," Hiccup said, gazing up at the dragon like he was a puzzle that needed figuring out. "Not even me." Eventually hunger should win over stubbornness, but I could be wrong. There's a first time for everything. The shockjaw stared at Genevieve, sniffing the air but didn't make any moves toward her again. Finn glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. Her lips were set in a pert frown as she stared back at the dragon. He wished he could read minds just to know what she was thinking in that moment. Can I try? Her question had caught him so off guard, he'd almost thought he'd imagined it. The thought of Genevieve in the ring with the shockjaw raised more than a few concerns. She was completely untrained and he was completely wild, stubborn and unsafe. No dragon was irredeemable. But after yesterday, even Finn had his doubts. Irritated, Finn turned and left the arena, mumbling to the others about needing air. The need to pace was getting overwhelming after doing nothing all day, and starting now would only put the shockjaw on edge. Sighing, he focused on the crunch of gravel beneath his boots and put space between him and the arena. He hadn't seen Zap since lunch. The thought of tracking her down and going for a long flight across the waves sounded nice. Jogging footsteps snagged his attention and he blinked in surprise when Genevieve appeared at his side, pale skin flushed from the wind. You're a fast walker. Long legs do tend to eat up the distance, Finn said, though he didn't feel any mirth behind the comment. He tried to shove away his annoyance from the arena, not wanting Genevieve to learn about his temper so early in their relationship. Friendship. Whatever it was. So shockjaw's Genevieve began, nearly jogging to keep up with him. Finn forced himself to slow his pace. What do they eat exactly? Cod, halibut, even tuna if you can get it. Shockjaws live in deep oceans, so whatever they can catch, I'm sure. Does Zap hunt on her own very often? She's pretty free range for a trained dragon, so I assume so. I wonder if he won't eat because he'd much rather go hunting on his own. I figured that much would be obvious. Finn realized his tone and winced, noting her surprised blink. Sorry. No, I'm sorry, she replied primly. You probably don't want to answer all my questions. It's fine. Is it? Finn ran his hands through his hair with a sigh. Sorry, yes, it is. I'm just a little stressed at the moment. The corners of her dark eyes crinkled. He'll come around eventually. You seem to have a lot of interest in that dragon for all the dozens of men he's incapacitated. Genevieve seemed to ponder the words and weigh her own carefully. He's afraid of everyone. Why? Who knows? He hasn't liked a single person that's gone in the ring with him. He barely tolerates my dad. I don't know how I'm going to take care of him once my dad is gone, let alone train him. Maybe you need to think outside the box. Try something different. Her request from that morning clanged through him. Like what? Have you noticed any similar behaviors that Zap displayed when you trained her? Gods, no, Finn said. The thought of his loving dragon ever acting that violent was strange. Well, maybe the first few minutes together she growled and tried to claw her way out. She was in a thick net and I had to cut her loose. After that she just followed me around. We parted ways and she showed up on Burke a couple of days later. Genevieve blinked in surprise, even as a sharp wind pulled her hair off her face. You didn't meet on Burke? No, I found her somewhere between Burke and... Finn paused. If she knew anything about Mayro, what it was known for. Some neighboring island. Not sure where exactly, just some random spit of land. It wasn't strictly a lie. Mostly an omission of certain details. It shouldn't have made him feel guilty. Ivan said they rescued the male from a net in the ocean, Genevieve mused, seemingly unfazed by his lack of detail. That can't be a coincidence. True, but we're not walking around with netting in our hands. That doesn't matter. If a man strikes a dog with a rod, will he grow violent with the man who hit him or only when he has the rod in hand? Finn slowed his steps. So you're saying he was caught in a net and now has a personal vendetta against all humans as a result? What if there's more to the story? Genevieve asked, her eyes lit with excitement. There was a hook in his paw, too. What if he was on a ship and mistreated, they threw him in the ocean to die, he couldn't escape the bonds, and then he was picked up by another ship, our ship? An interesting theory, but we don't have any proof that happened, Finn said. For all we know, some tribe attacked his nest as a youngling and that's why he hates humans. True, but mine makes more sense. Finn couldn't help the laugh. I still don't understand why you're so interested. He's a terrified creature that we're trying to force into submission. I think that's sad and, well, isn't the point of all this to befriend them first? Genevieve asked. Amusement slipping away, Finn nodded. So what's your suggestion? She blinked. I wasn't suggesting anything. No, but we've established the problem. It's implied that you have a solution. Finn shoved his hands into his pockets. If you had the chance, what would you do differently? Genevieve looked back at the arena in the distance. The chill wind shifted and blew her blonde curls across her face. Finn couldn't help but stare at the thickly coiled strands as she pushed them out of her eyes. I won't get a chance, so it doesn't matter what I think. I just feel bad for him. Finn surveyed her expression, feeling some emotion twist inside him at her words. Something that he couldn't quite place. Compassion is the beginning of change. Genevieve met his eyes, brows lifting ever so slightly. Don't underestimate yourself, General, you're more capable than you know. How do you know that? Genevieve breathed. You hardly know me. Finn gave her a wry smile. Because I've been here less than a week and I've already seen proof of your kindness. That alone will take you places. Genevieve smiled, but her eyes rolled quickly. Sure, to another home where I'll care for a family until I'm old and grey and my bones turn to dust. Finn breathed a short laugh. Well, that took a dark turn. Alas, such is my life. It doesn't have to be, that's what I'm saying. This isn't Burke, Genevieve said sharply. Some things will never change. And really, I don't say that like I don't want a family of my own someday, but... She shook her head. You have the freedom to do as you wish. I don't. Because I'm a guy or because I come from Burke? Finn asked, perhaps a bit boldly. He knew he probably shouldn't be so cut and dry, but alas, tact had never been his friend. To his relief, Genevieve merely sighed. Burke has always been unorthodox. Jatans believe women have only one place to be, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Having a family is a good, desirable thing. But Jat will not change that so easily. Finn squinted. Generations of Burkians once said that about the enmity between dragons and Vikings, and yet that changed overnight. That's different. Is it? Finn asked. It might be a different kind of culture change, but it's still a change in culture. Genevieve crossed her arms. Maybe so, but it would never take place so quickly. Granted, most shifts in culture don't happen overnight. But what I don't understand is why you're going back and forth. What do you mean? I mean, Finn said, stepping closer to her. Why can't you admit that you want more out of life? 1 minute you're excited and brave and hungry, and then the next minute you remember that you're wearing a skirt and defend the very ideals that you wish didn't exist. You're inconsistent. Genevieve frowned. Maybe the thought of rebelling against my parents is harder to swallow. You don't have to rebel, but you could talk to them about it. You saw how well that went this morning. Finn raised his hands. Hey, I think your mom handled it quite well considering. You even shocked Eric and he's never shocked. She sighed, avoiding his eyes. Even so, I couldn't tell you why the dragon intrigues me. I like to learn new things. Maybe that's all it is. I'm sure it will wear off in time. Not if the entire village is riding dragons and you have to see it every day, Finn said, then added, well, half the village. Genevieve chewed her full bottom lip, snagging his attention far more easily than it should have. For all his inner pep talks on getting to know her as a friend and trying to focus on work, she was far too pretty and he was far too easily distracted. And how could he not be? With her pale skin flushed from the cold and blonde curls blowing in the wind. Not to mention how fun she was to talk to, how every time she entered the room he wanted to run across the room to talk to her. All this he thought in the span of a blink. His heart lurched at the sudden longing he felt. He forced himself to look away and cleared his throat. Too soon. Taking a deep breath of cold air, he forced himself to push the sudden love-crazy thoughts away. He needed to get a hold of himself. How long will you keep him in captivity? Genevieve asked quietly. It took him a moment to remember who they'd been talking about. Meeting Finn's eyes, she added in a more pressing tone, if you can't train him and he doesn't choose a rider, how long will we keep him in that cage? Finn held her gaze. Dragon rider or not, believe me when I tell you that I'm not fond of anyone being held against their will. Genevieve's intense gaze softened and he could sense her curiosity building, so he quickly added, I'll give it a week. If he doesn't choose a rider by next Friday, I'll let him go free. Genevieve's expression cleared, gratefulness filling her eyes. Thank you. He nodded, feeling the weight of the words settle across his shoulders. It didn't feel like a burden though. Rather, it felt like a promise. One that he wouldn't break. He hoped he could find a rider for the Shockjaw, someone who could be his match. He wondered about the possibility of Genevieve giving it a shot, but he'd leave that decision for her and her parents to figure out. Like his dad had advised, he wouldn't be the one to cause that sort of trouble. But if he couldn't find a rider for the Shockjaw, he'd release the dragon back into the wild. Genevieve's words had struck a chord, especially her analogy of an abused dog. He knew what that felt like. The realization that the dragon wanted to go free and he was partially responsible for keeping it locked up. Genevieve was right to question it. He was ashamed to admit he hadn't thought of it first. After all he'd experienced, who was he to decide if the dragon should go or stay? Wasn't that the Shockjaw's decision to make? Training dragons had been a part of his entire life. He couldn't think of any other times when a dragon didn't want to be trained, who didn't want to bond with a human, whether it was his dad or mom or anyone else. That was the premise, that these huge, fanged, winged beasts weren't as ferocious as they looked. They were intelligent, gentle creatures who were still so misunderstood by most of the world. But there were still some dragons who mistrusted humans. If the Shockjaw really wanted to go back to the wild and be free from humans, who was Finn to decide that it should stay and do his bidding? With the acrid scent of nail polish purchased from Johann's stores and the dining table covered in hairbrushes, ribbons, and ties, Astrid almost didn't recognize her house. Coupled with the near-constant giggles from the 4 girls in the living room, she wondered what her husband and son would think of this sort of girly chaos. Is this what their home might have looked like if they'd had more girls? Astrid carried a tray of drinks and cookies into the living room and set it among Adriana, Taryn, Inga and Morgan. They grinned up at her and instantly dug in, eating the chocolate mint cookies with fervor. Gods, we haven't made these in forever, Adriana sighed. She was sitting on the floor in front of Taryn, who weaved intricate braids into her luminous blonde hair. Adriana had bemoaned the fact that her hair had grown in thicker in the past few months, but she still had yet to cut it. Astrid vaguely wondered if Eric had anything to do with it. You have crumbs on your cleavage, Inga stated. Don't care, Adriana replied. With them getting bigger every day, it's a lost cause. Morgan rolled her eyes. Please. At least you could enjoy being smaller before natural causes made them bigger. Me, on the other hand, she waved a hand across her impressive midsection with a sigh of annoyance. I make it look easy, girls. Inga took a cup of black coffee and drank it without so much as a blink. I don't hear the boys complaining. Taryn blushed but Adriana and Morgan scoffed. Boys are weird and gross. Amen. Astrid began to fold laundry, not bothering to be neat about it. She had to admit, despite the fact she'd never been impressed or enthused by girl talk, her best girlfriend growing up had been rough nut. After all, she was finding the girls' conversation entertaining. She'd woken that morning to find Adriana sleeping on the couch, bags under her eyes. Cliff had emerged moments later and also stared at her in confusion. They'd opted to let her sleep, and when she had woken an hour later, she told them what had happened. Well, she'd told them she'd had a nightmare and Tough Nut had walked her home. It wasn't until Cliff left for work that Adriana had burst into tears and told Astrid everything. Astrid didn't have much experience with nightmares. Hiccup had always had them since Adriana's kidnapping. It seemed his body was hardwired to turn his stress into night terrors so severe, they'd wake him up in cold sweats. Adriana was the same way. Hearing her daughter's story, seeing the fear light up her green eyes in ways she hadn't seen in months had almost driven Astrid to write Hiccup and Eric. No. Adriana had said. Afraid as she'd been, her voice had been steady as she added, they have work to do. They'll be back in 2 days and I'll tell them what happened. But for now, I'll just stay home with you. And that had been that. For the duration of the morning and afternoon, however, Astrid had been unhappy to see her daughter staring at nothing in the living room. She looked like a wilted flower that hadn't been watered in some time. She needed something to remove her thoughts from the nightmare. But Adriana was not one for surprises or being social if she wasn't in the mood, so she'd asked her daughter if she might invite a few of the girls over for the evening. They'd have dinner and Astrid would let them have the house to do whatever they pleased. Astrid had been surprised and pleased when her daughter had accepted. Taryn had been the one to invite the other girls. Astrid had caught her at Grandma Ingerman's and planted the seed. Taryn had arrived at 5 o'clock on the dot with Inga and Morgan in tow, dinner sides in hand. So on to more important things, Taryn said brightly, leaning forward slightly to meet Adriana's eye. Are you excited for the baby? Adriana gazed down at her belly with a mixed look of worry and excitement. Yes, I think so. It's strange. Which part? Inga asked. The big belly, mood swings, non-stop eating, peeing non-stop. All of the above. Plus some. Being a healer in training, I've seen my fair share of pregnant women and heard tell of all their woes and complaints. Astrid chuckled. Not every pregnancy is the same, girls. Each of you will likely have different experiences. What was it like for you? Morgan asked. Well, for one, I was pregnant with two, Astrid said, dropping a pile of folded washcloths in a basket. One can't really tell which, but one of them was constantly kicking, and I have a sneaking suspicion which child it was. The girls giggled, knowing she was referring to Finn. I mean, for being pregnant with twins, not even Tasha realized it. Imagine my displeasure after giving birth to Finn that I started having more contractions. I remember telling Hiccup that I was going to kill him when it was all over. Laughing, Taryn began pulling Adriana's hair back into a long braid. I don't imagine that was pleasant in the moment, but it was exciting afterwards, right? Astrid considered her answer. Her first thought was of the horror of her daughter emerging lifeless, unmoving. Not breathing. Of watching her husband breathe into their baby's mouth and press on her belly, trying to make her breathe. Then the indescribable joy when at last she coughed and screamed for the first time. But she didn't wish to terrify her currently pregnant daughter about what could happen. Any pregnancy had its dangers, but Adriana didn't need more stress. Of course, Astrid said, dropping the rest of the folded clothes in the basket and leaning back. Bringing them home, well, since we'd only planned for one, we had to make some adjustments. It was hard for a time with two crying babies keeping us up at night, but we managed. When they started crawling and then walking, gods, that was a whole other form of chaos. The girls laughed again and Adriana said, including the time Finn streaked across the village. What? Morgan gasped in mixed disbelief and amusement. He would, Inga muttered. He was little, Astrid amended. 3, maybe 4. Thankfully it was not a recurring issue. Anyway, it's been a good life. Hard, but when I married the heir to Burke, I was already well aware that life with him would have its ups and downs. Really? Taryn asked. Well, yes, Astrid said. No marriage is perfect, but Hiccup and I had been friends for years already. I'd followed him from one side of the archipelago to the other on Dragonback. We had good days and some very bad days. He made stupid decisions sometimes. We both did. Meeting their eyes, she smiled, but I knew I loved him. That crazy Viking that nobody understood. When did you know you loved him? Morgan asked. Astrid blinked in surprise. I don't know. I don't think it ever happened in one day. I think over time, as I watched and learned and befriended him, things slowly began to change. It certainly wasn't right away, when he turned our world upside down. Maybe it was when I realized he was willing to do anything for me. Maybe it was during one of our first fights as a couple that he was willing to be honest to my face and tell me something I didn't want to hear. Because he cared enough to tell me the truth about what he was thinking. Maybe it was his compassion or his endurance. I'm not sure. She blinked and found the girls staring into space in thought. A soft smile was on Adriana's face and Astrid would have bet good money she was thinking the same thing about Eric. Love isn't always fireworks. It's not always obvious. But when you find someone who cares about you consistently, who's honest and kind, who doesn't sacrifice their beliefs but is willing to compromise on things that aren't black and white. Well, that person certainly deserves some consideration at least. I take it Eric fit the mold as well? Inga asked Adriana, who blinked out of her thoughts. Yes, Adriana said. I wish I'd seen it sooner. Or maybe I did and I just wasn't brave enough to say anything. But if you had, Taryn said carefully, you probably wouldn't be pregnant now. True, Adriana said. Do you regret it? Morgan asked. Not saying something to him sooner, I mean. Astrid watched her daughter think through the words, consider her answer thoroughly before she slid her hands onto her belly. Maybe some things. I wished I'd been braver to see the signs. The good and the bad, from both of the boys I cared about. And as terrifying as things got and as hard as it has been, I do care about this baby. More than I thought I would. I can't possibly think that this is the happiest I'll be about him or her. She looked each of her friends in the eye and finally met Astrid's. So no, I don't regret it. Everything happens for a reason and, like Daddy said months ago, there's healing in this. Eric and I still got married and we can still have a happy life together. So I'm not going to live my life sad about the past. I'm going to move on with my husband and we're going to raise our baby together. And if Brandi never sets foot on Burke again, Adriana's eyes darkened and she locked her fingers around her stomach with a touch of finality. Well, you and Dad can tear him to pieces for all I care. Astrid's heart swelled with pride. The comment about Brandine aside, she didn't deserve to have such a compassionate daughter. She was wise beyond her years. And yes, when Brandine came back, because Astrid had no doubts they would see him again, she would gladly take him apart slowly over the course of many days. Silence ensued for a few moments before Inga snorted, draining the last bits of her black coffee. Well, that took a dark turn. You're really inspiring, you know that. Morgan said quietly. Adriana blinked in surprise and Morgan added, when I was dating Kale, they were always mean to you. Somehow you still hung out with us as a group. I wasn't always kind to you either. Adriana dropped her gaze. You weren't to blame for bad boys' behavior. No, but I am responsible for myself. I don't know if I ever apologized for how I used to treat you, but I'm very sorry. Astrid felt her heart warm at the scene unfolding, especially when Adriana leaned forward and gave Morgan a tight hug. The curly-haired blonde had truly come a long way since she'd dumped Kale all those months ago. She'd slowly been learning what it was to be kind and happy and have truly good friends. But it seems you and I have something in common, Morgan said, releasing Adriana and wiping her eyes. Both of our boyfriends cheated on us with the same girl. Wretched tramp, Taryn muttered, patting Adriana's arms and marching into the kitchen suddenly. The words were as close to a curse as they would get from the auburn-haired girl. Oh, now you've done it, Inga snickered. Mama, Taryn's cleaning. Taryn huffed from organizing the countertops. So I need an outlet when I'm irritated. I didn't realize that was a crime. No crime, just be grateful we know you so well. I'll have to tell Cliff to be warned when he comes home from work, if he finds you scrubbing the floors, to back off and draw you a hot bath with some lavender, because you're either on your period or really ticked off at something he did. Ignoring the girl's laughs, Taryn flushed. Cliff is far from irritating. Ha! Morgan cackled. And I'm the heir of the Roman Empire. Let's not get started on those barbarians. Astrid huffed, hopping off the couch to join Taryn in the kitchen. Johan and all his crazy stories were going to get all of them into trouble one day. Speaking of Cliff, shouldn't he be back by now? Adriana asked. It's getting late. I told him it was girls' night and to find somewhere else to be until late. Astrid said. Morgan lurched to her feet and checked the nearest window. How do we know he's not spying? Oh please, he's not that bad. Taryn cried defensively. That boy has no self-control. Yes, actually, he has lots of self-control. Why so defensive, Taryn? Did he need to implement said self-control in certain dark and lonely places? Inga asked, shrugging her brows wildly. Taryn gaped in horror even as the other girls cackled madly, even Adriana. Oh girls, leave Taryn alone, Astrid said, fighting her own chuckles. They really shouldn't tease their demure friend. Even if being the purest in the group was an outlet in and of itself. Gods knew if she'd had such a friend as a teenager, Astrid would have teased her relentlessly as well. Cheeks burning, Taryn hung up the wet rag to dry and planted a hand on her hip. So Morgan, when are you and Evan going to start dating? Morgan paused in straightening her shirt. What do you mean? Oh please, anyone can see he's into you, Taryn continued. Wait, I didn't know this. Adriana said, holding her hands up for Inga to help her off the floor. How long has this been going on? Please, this has been a thing in the works since the summer, since that giant wave that Zap and Cliff made nearly knocked them clean over. Inga drawled. Evan kept Morgan standing, shielding her with his body. It was a truly disgusting thing to behold. Morgan made a sound of disapproval with her lips. Me and Evan. He's so quiet and, well, you know. No I don't, but please, do go on. Adriana said as she sat at the table, taking another cookie from a plate in the center. Morgan rolled her eyes with crossed arms. He's just always there in the background, not really making any moves or saying much. So he's steady and always present, that's not bad. No, but he's not exactly chatty. Quiet isn't a bad thing. No. Maybe he's trying to think of something to say. Maybe. Or he's waiting for you to say something to him because Adriana gasped. What if he's shy? Oh Evan the shy and Morgan the babe, Inga sighed dramatically. Their babies shall be beautiful. Morgan's eyes glittered in amusement but she didn't blush or deny it. And Taryn added triumphantly. I have reason to believe that he has walked you home more than a few times. I never took you for a spy, Taryn Morgan said, blue eyes glittering. He's just being kind. Is that all? Morgan huffed. That doesn't mean he wants to date me. Actually, Astrid said finally with much amusement. That may very well be a big indicator. Does he try to do little things for you? Leave you gifts anywhere? Try to be places where you are? Well, Morgan paused. We're always in the same group. Like I said, he's always present. He doesn't usually say much. Okay, well, does he always seem to be looking at you? Astrid asked, hopping up on the counter. Not in a creepy way, but if you look at him, does he suddenly avoid eye contact and look away? Morgan's eyes widened. I'll have to pay better attention, but I think so. Here's the best telltale sign, Astrid said. I noticed it when my mother mentioned it to me about Hiccup. When you walk in the room, do his eyebrows jump up? He doesn't even notice he's doing it. When I started paying attention, Hiccup's brows would shoot up every time. At first I thought it was just an old wives' tale, but if you watch, you'll see it happen. When a man sees a woman he's attracted to, his eyebrows will jump up. Adriana was gaping. Does Eric do it? My love, I watch my own husband, not yours. Inga scoffed but didn't speak. Astrid wondered what she'd thought but refrained from saying out loud. Morgan sighed, taking a seat at the table. Well, I guess I'll have to pay better attention. I don't know, after everything with Kale I just don't feel like anyone would want to date me, I guess. Adriana took her hand. Oh, don't tell yourself that. You're different than you were. And we all know that not all guys try to take advantage of girls. Evan seems like a sweet guy. If he's willing to be your friend and spend time with you, maybe you should give him a chance and see what happens. He's also the opposite of Kale, Taryn said. Maybe you're hesitating because he's different from what you're used to. Maybe, Morgan sighed. It's like I tell Finn all the time, Astrid added. We aren't defined by our past mistakes. We have to learn from our mistakes and move on. After all, how can we truly learn to love someone else if we're always focusing on the past? I can't possibly imagine what Finn could be upset about, Inga groused. Maybe you don't know him like you think you do, Adriana replied sharply. Astrid cleared her throat, watching the girls glare at each other for a few moments. She was proud that Adriana would defend her brother, even from her friends, but she didn't want them to fight. Finn has made his choices and I believe he made them for the right reasons. He certainly could be in a worse place than he is today. Taryn said quietly. Surprisingly, the comment seemed to diffuse the tension. Inga relaxed and nodded. At any rate Morgan, if you don't think you're ready to date anyone then it's okay to decide not to, Astrid said. But in time if you see the signs of potential and find he's nice to be around, then maybe it would be a leap of faith to give it a shot. A new relationship, a fresh start. Morgan nodded, pondering the words. She didn't look as concerned or weirded out by the idea as she had been a few minutes ago. Just refrain from making me your flower girl, Inga drawled. You'll have the prettiest dress second to mine, Jorgensen. The girls giggled and the last of the tension melted away. Suddenly the sound of claws on wood appeared and they looked up to see a blue terrible terror climbing down the rafters. He flapped down and landed on Adriana's shoulder, holding out his leg. She squealed and pulled the message off and didn't spare them another glance as she began to read. It seemed Eric had finally sent her note after 3 days away. Well? Inga demanded. Has anyone died? Nope, Adriana said, pushing the letter into her chest with a smirk. But you wouldn't want to read this, Inga. It's just too gushy and intimate for you to handle. And that is my cue to leave, Inga announced, standing and moving to pull her boots on. My parents wanted me home by 10 anyway. Thanks for having me over, it was fun. You're welcome. Come over anytime. Astrid said. Adriana also bade her goodbye and just barely managed to finish reading Eric's message before the other two girls began to pack up their things to leave. When the girls hopped into their saddles and their dragons took off, Astrid had barely closed the door before Adriana had scurried upstairs to read the note once more. Astrid chuckled in amusement but gave herself a mental pat on the back. Her daughter would not be having any nightmares tonight. Chapter 36, Freedom. Chapter text. Friday was a blur of activity for Finn. The sun was shining in a cloudless sky, providing a touch of warmth to the air. Even the wind had died down, offering them a brief respite. After hours of working with the Jatans, he had worked up a light sweat beneath his fur-lined coat and eventually shed it altogether. The long-sleeved woolen shirt he wore had kept him warm throughout the morning and he hid a smirk when he heard a few Jatan girls whispering nearby as he worked. The Jatans had returned to the arena bursting with questions, which only made it easier for him to ignore the pit of nervousness clawing up his throat. He didn't think he was ready for his dad and Eric and the councilman to return to Berk yet, but the time had come at last. In a couple of hours, he'd be in charge of dragon training. It was a strange thing to consider, being the top authority. As a child he'd always wanted to be the one to call the shots. Now that he was older it was far more serious than he'd ever expected it to be. What if he screwed up and someone got seriously injured? What if someone died? What if there was a riot of teenage girls who wanted to train and Ivan put his head on the chopping block for it? He rolled his eyes and shoved the thoughts away. He could handle this. He didn't need his father to hold his hand, who was he kidding? Still, he was thankful that the Shockjaw had at least remained calm without so much as a glare at the trainees and their dragons. He'd taken to watching Finn beadily throughout the day, not quite convinced apparently. Finn simply carried on like normal. The dragon would have to get used to the fact that they would be working together. After all, once Hiccup left, there wouldn't be anyone else to keep the dragon in check besides him. He sincerely hoped the dragon wouldn't throw any more temper tantrums or he'd forego his promise to Genevieve and release the dragon tomorrow. Hey Finn, look. Finn looked up in time to see Thuggery swing himself onto his blue monstrous nightmare's back. He and the dragon preened, clearly proud to be one of the first duos to do so. Thuggery had been railing Finn almost non-stop about when they'd be flying. Finn had told him last night to have at it if he really thought he was ready. Thuggery had pursed his lips and conceded that maybe they weren't ready just yet. But he still swore that he'd be the first trainee in the air. Finn nodded in approval as he approached. Not bad. Just make sure if you plan on doing that without the right precautions in place you'll find yourself with a singed butt. What oh? Thuggery quickly hopped off the dragon's neck with a chuckle and patted its leg. Maybe not yet then. Maybe not yet, Finn agreed, but slapped the other teenager's shoulder amicably. But well done. A large cart carrying fresh fish wheeled into the arena and many dragons' heads perked up at the smell. Feeding time. He watched as the trainees gathered around the cart and fed their dragons. From the corner of his eye he saw the Shockjaw subtly sniffing the air. They still hadn't gotten him to eat. His dad wasn't kidding when he'd said the dragon was perhaps just as stubborn as Finn. The dragon had to be starving if he hadn't eaten in more than a week. Zap pranced between the rows of dragons and trainees, trying to steal fish from their hands. A few dragons growled at her, but she merely replied with a stout aroof and kept moving. One trainee even went so far as to boldly shove her nose back, which made her blink in surprise. "You've got quite the reputation, Missy. No games now, this fish is for Leaf." "Games?" Struck with an idea, Finn walked to the cart and whistled for Zap. He grabbed a couple of large cod and didn't need to look to know she was already trotting toward him. Just as she reached the cart, Finn spun and took off across the arena. Zap yelped in surprise and then growled. He grinned at the sound of her pounding footsteps and picked up his pace, dodging dragon tails and wings. Trainees yelped, hopping out of his way. He knew he probably looked ridiculous to the viewers in the stands, but he didn't care. It was the male Shockjaw's attention he really wanted. A snapping through heavy wing beats sounded and he ducked into a slide beneath a table of poisons before Zap could tackle him. She yelped and dodged, angling her body so she didn't collide with the glass jars. Using the momentum, Finn kicked back up to his feet on the other side and slammed to a stop, gritting his teeth to slow down his speed before shooting back the other direction. He laughed at the growl of irritation that sounded from his dragon's maw. Zap caught up in seconds, snapping her jaws at the cod in his hand. She missed and he nearly dropped it, the oily tail slippery and growing warm in his palm. With a savage fling, he threw it high into the air and ducked when Zap's shimmering wings nearly knocked him over as she launched upwards. She snatched the fish from the air and flew back, landing low on her haunches as she stared at the other fish in his hand. "Wait, you want this?" Finn asked teasingly, drawing the fish back and forth in a tantalizing line. A quick glance at the male Shockjaw 10 feet away confirmed his interest. His deep blue eyes followed the fish as well. Zap's claws dug into the stones as she prepared to pounce. Finn tensed, waiting and drawing his arm away from his body and adjusting his grip on the fish. Zap dove and Finn turned, throwing the fish with all his might at the male Shockjaw. Any other dragon would have snatched the cod out of the air, happy to be chosen over another dragon to be fed. With the way he'd practically been salivating over the fish, watching as Finn teased Zap, instinct should have taken over. Instead, the male Shockjaw merely flinched when the cod slapped him right upside the head and watched as it landed onto the hard cobblestones with a wet squelch. "Oh come on!" Finn growled. He ignored the girls' giggles that echoed around the arena and stalked to the Shockjaw, who stared back flatly. "We both know you wanted it. What, am I just not good enough for you?" The Shockjaw growled lowly and used his tail to shove the cod toward Zap, who'd been sitting nearby with a rather put-out expression at being tricked. She brightened and snatched the cod off the ground, smacking her lips happily. "Oh ho, and now you're trying to butter up my girl, I see how it is," Finn hissed. "For the record, she was mine first." The male Shockjaw grumbled a sound of displeasure, staring down his nose at Finn. "Now listen here, you big bag of bones," Finn replied, poking him in the chest. "We're not going to make any progress if you don't eat something." "Give it up," Finn Helga called from a group of deadly nadders. "I think he does these things just to annoy you." Finn growled and walked away. He noticed his dad and fish legs leaning against the outer railing and rolled his eyes. "Maybe you should just take him to Burke with you." Hiccup was staring at the Shockjaw in fascination. He has to give in at some point. The teasing and playing with Zap was a good try though. "Did you see the way he shoved the cod back at Zap?" Fishlegs asked excitedly. It almost looked like he was asserting her dominance because she'd already laid claim to it. "That's certainly what it looked like." Great, Finn muttered, wiping his hands off on a towel. "While you nerds add notes to your dragon diaries, I'll just he cut off at the sight of a certain blonde running through the stands." Genevieve's knees collided with a bench, but she victoriously snatched a scarf out of the air before it could blow further away. A strong wind had blown in quite suddenly and apparently snatched the scarf out of her hands. She retreated to her seat beside Kiev and rolled the scarf up in a ball to keep it from blowing away again. Finn blinked and returned his focus to the Shockjaw and realized they'd both been staring at her. Looking between them, Finn dropped the towel and approached the Shockjaw. His eyes snapped back to Finn as he approached and the Shockjaw grumbled a complaint before looking back at Genevieve. Finn squinted at her. After her numerous questions and asking to be given a chance to train, and with the shockjaw showing her the most interest out of any human he'd met yet, Finn easily forgot his father's warning. "Is something wrong?" Kiev asked. Clearly Finn had been staring long enough for them to notice. Finn glanced at him briefly before looking to Genevieve. "He wants you." Genevieve blinked. "Excuse me." Screwing the consequences, he said the very words his dad had advised him not to say, "I want you in the ring." She had to be hearing things. Genevieve could have sworn she heard Hiccup sigh. She stared at Finn, shocked that he'd spoken, that he'd even suggested it. Sure, she'd asked Hiccup about it just yesterday morning, and sure, Finn had even asked her yesterday afternoon what she would do if given a chance to train. But she didn't expect him to actually say something in training. Her father spoke before she could. "No. No, no, no," he laughed in amusement. "Finn, my daughter won't be training any dragons. She'd be right next to me the whole time." Finn replied. "He tried to meet her yesterday and I saw the way he perked up when she chased the scarf. He was looking right at her. He was following the movement of another individual," Kiev argued. "He does that with everyone. There's something there, sir, I can see it by the way he looks at her." Indignation rose up in her throat. She hated that she was being talked about like she wasn't sitting right there, as if she couldn't speak for herself. Kiev hid a second laugh. "All due respect, son, he isn't a hormonal teenage boy, he's a very unpredictable dragon." Finn crossed his arms with a small smirk. "All due respect, sir, I am the professional." Genevieve smiled at his little bit of sass. "Besides, dragons are better than boys. Boys are stupid." This time she did laugh. Kiev scoffed and said nothing. Genevieve swallowed her nerves, willing herself to be brave. "Let me try, Dad." "No, Jen. What's the harm in trying? A lady doesn't." 5 minutes. Genevieve begged. She didn't want to hear another speech about what ladies don't do. If this was her only chance to do something new and outside the norm of her sheltered life, she was going to beg for it. 5 minutes, and if it doesn't work, then forget it. Kiev mulled it over, glancing between her, Finn and the distrusting beast with dark, scrutinizing eyes. "Your mother is going to kill me." 5 minutes. Genevieve stared, unsure she'd heard correctly. She hadn't expected him to give in. "Really? Oh, thank you, Dad." She hugged him tightly, heart suddenly racing. "I'll take 5 minutes." Finn agreed and marched toward the door to let her in. Fighting a grin, Genevieve pulled out of the embrace and pecked her father's cheek. Before he could change his mind, she turned and ran the length of the arena. She ignored the friends that called her name as she darted past, not wanting to waste a moment. She'd been granted the chance to train a dragon, and even if it only lasted a few short minutes, by the gods she was going to grab onto it with both hands and savor it. Her cheeks were flushed by the time she reached the inner gate that led to the main floor. Her heart stuttered when it swung open to reveal Finn, who offered her a hand with a rogue smirk. "Welcome to dragon training, Miss Sullivan." Biting her lip, Genevieve stared at his hand. Her heart pounded in her chest with excitement as she took his hand. Strong, calloused fingers gripped hers as she stepped into the ring, and suddenly she'd arrived. After weeks of pining and wishing and dreaming, she was in the arena. The circular chamber was different without the former chain dome that used to keep the dragons inside. Now fully open to the sky and elements, it felt larger, more spacious. Maybe it was her nerves playing tricks on her, but Finn looked even taller. The shockjaw looked even larger. She was so out of her element suddenly, she gulped. Finn strode to the nearest table. "Okay, come here for a second." "Finn, if a single hair on her head gets singed, I'll send you packing," Kiev said from the railing beside Hiccup, whose expression was firm and unyielding. Genevieve realized the chief was glaring at his son, who was clearly avoiding eye contact because he didn't spare them even a glance. Instead, Finn replied, "I'll take that chance, sir." She had to give him props for not withering under her father's tone. To her, he said, "This is going to work, don't worry. See the way he's looking at you." Genevieve gulped at the shockjaw, who stared back. His cerulean eyes were wary and he hadn't moved from his spot sitting on the stone, though his wings shifted. There was no shimmer within the folds. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, given how volatile he could be. Now that she was actually doing this, her insides were twisting with nerves. Yes, like I'm about to be dinner. Finn snickered. He's not going to hurt you. Here, take this. She held out her hands and winced when he gave her a large cod. Your dad won't kill me for making you hold a fish, will he? Genevieve looked at him, scandalized. I've gone fishing before, fearless Finn. Finn laughed and led her back towards the shock jaw. It's just Finn, remember? Right. She rolled her eyes and stopped when he pulled her back by her inner elbow. All right, you've been in here enough that I think you know rule number 1. Finn asked. Genevieve felt the weight of numerous eyes resting on her. She called up her training as a performer and pretended that this was just another stage. This was no different. The thought stabilized her and she exhaled. Trust him and he will trust you. Yup. And what's the best way to make friends? Genevieve made a face and looked up at Finn. Feed him. Exactly. Finn's grin faltered and he muttered through his teeth, barring the fact that he hasn't eaten anything in our presence to date, but hey, that's why we're here. To see who he might trust. He nodded forward to the shockjaw, who was beginning to sniff the air. So by your logic, Genevieve raised an eyebrow. I should make you food in order to be friends. They do say a way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Well, as long as you like burnt chicken and doughy biscuits. Genevieve said. Finn blinked in confusion and she winced. Never mind. Now probably wasn't the best time to admit in front of all these witnesses that she, the retired chief's daughter, couldn't cook to save her life. The scandal of it all. After all, how would she feed her family one day if she couldn't do the simplest of tasks? Focus. Dragon training. Well, you seem like decent person, Finn said with a smirk. I suppose you don't have to bring me food to be my friend. He winked, making her insides squirm. Genevieve giggled but focused her attention back on the dragon. Her amusement slipped away when the dragon stood and began smelling the air eagerly, carefully stepping closer. Finn edged back as the dragon advanced and Genevieve faltered, slightly panicky at the idea of him leaving her. It's okay, I'm just moving behind you to give him space. Genevieve swallowed and watched as the shockjaw edged closer. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eyes. She couldn't believe his size and height. He was slightly larger in build and length than Zap, who was still sitting on the outskirts of the ring. Eric also stood from the sidelines, watching with a critical eye. Relax, Finn murmured, making her jump slightly. He wants to trust you, but he can sense your unease. After another pause, he whispered, just think of him as a giant puppy. Puppies don't have sharp fangs and claws. Genevieve whispered back. Have you ever played with a puppy? Finn whispered back. They bite too. Genevieve bit back a grin. Now hold the fish out to him. Genevieve obeyed and stared into the deep blue depths of the dragon's eyes. She waited with bated breath for something to happen. He leaned forward, sniffing, blue eyes darting between her and the fish. Suddenly, with a flash of teeth, he snatched the fish out of her hands. Genevieve flinched back and collided with a solid chest behind her, Finn's chin grazing the top of her head. She quickly stepped away with a mumbled apology, but he pointed at the dragon, unfazed. And at long last, the big beastie eats, Finn said, a note of pride in his voice. Good job. Genevieve stared up at the dragon in amazement. She'd actually fed him. She noticed the impressed murmurings of the other trainees and even her friends in the stands. The shockjaw smacked his lips and then, with narrowed eyes and a rumbling growl in his throat, marched toward them, sniffing eagerly. Genevieve's heart lurched when the beast snuffled her skirt from boots to collar, clearly looking for more fish. She almost didn't notice that she'd pressed her back against Finn's chest again, but she didn't know what to do. I'm sorry, that's all he gave me. She squeaked. It's his fault. Finn snorted derisively, stepping out behind her with a gentle hand on her back so she wouldn't fall over. Right, blame the teacher. I see how it is. Well, hey, it's true. Genevieve smirked, staring up at the shockjaw. He was sniffing her hair but stopped quickly when he realized there were indeed no fish to be found there. And hold your hands out. Finn smirked. Hold my hands, Genevieve obeyed with confusion, right in time for the shockjaw to suddenly gag repeatedly. With a disgusting squelch, he regurgitated half the fish into her open palms. She gave a horrified gasp and stared at Finn, who was holding up his hands innocently. She heard her father give a cry of indignation. That's what they do, it's been happening all week. You should have seen this coming. You. Genevieve willed herself not to gag at the thick, mucus-like drool hanging from her hands in long strands. She made a face at the dragon. Thanks. Now what do I do with it? Finn turned an amused smile up at the railing. A brave man would take a bite. With a lazy smirk, Hiccup spread his palms wide. Hey, somebody had to do the dirty work. Exclamations of disgust erupted through the arena and Hiccup shrugged once again. Just be thankful we discovered that dragons won't give us the cold shoulder if we don't partake. Therefore Finn nodded over her shoulder. You can dump it in one of those buckets and wash your hands. Genevieve sighed in relief, eagerly disposing of the fish and washing her hands quickly. Eric waved from his position nearby. Nice job. Thank you, Genevieve said, shaking her hands dry. Her fingers quickly became cold, but she didn't care. Did the creature have to do something so vile? Her father was ranting. That's bonding. Why didn't he just give her a kiss on the cheek and call it good? Because this isn't a hormonal, teenage boy, sir, it's a dragon. Finn sassed, quoting Kiev from minutes before. Genevieve giggled as the men bantered back and forth on the ethics of dragon conduct. When she turned to return to the center, she jumped. The shockjaw was standing right behind her, cooing curiously. Well. Genevieve stared up at him. You do like me, huh? The shockjaw bowed his head and sniffed her hair once again, nearly touching her forehead. Smiling, she reached up to touch his nose, but he straightened once again, avoiding her hand. She could feel as well as hear the rumbling moan deep in his chest. The edge of his lip curled as his growl grew louder and she pulled her hand away. I guess we're not ready for that just yet. Hiccup commented from above. But well done, Genevieve. That's excellent progress and it only took 5 minutes. Excellent, Kiev said as he opened the door to the stands. Now Finn can make headway. Me. Finn blinked. I think we just proved that he wants Genevieve. And I said no. You had your 5 minutes. Kiev said in a stiff tone. He held the door open wider. Genevieve. Her heart thudded to her boots. She stared at Finn and the dragon, wishing she could stay longer. She didn't want to leave. Finn looked slightly dejected as he stared back at her, but he didn't argue further. She even chanced a glance at Hiccup, who said nothing, but she could see the reservation in his eye. Clearly the Haddocks were seeing something that her father wasn't. With a last baleful look at the shockjaw, she took her father's hand and stepped back up into the stands. But instead of sitting, she gathered her things and quickly left the arena, unaware of the 2 pairs of blue eyes watching as she disappeared. Eric couldn't help but feel slightly awkward the last few hours on Jet. He was excited to return to Adriana and the baby. He missed Cliff and Taryn and the others too. But the frosty glares being swapped between Hiccup and Finn were starting to set his teeth on edge. He checked his saddlebags once again, even as Ivan clapped Hiccup on the shoulder and wished them safe travels. I truly appreciate everything you've done this week, Hiccup. Thank you. Of course, I'm happy to help. I only wish I could stay longer. You've got the convocation to prepare for, Ivan said. We'll be in good hands. My men paid you all accordingly. Hiccup rolled his eyes. Your hospitality was payment enough. Nonsense, Ivan insisted. Besides, some of us are planning to build a house this spring. He smiled at Eric, who nodded his thanks. The bag of gold coins the councilman had handed him had nearly fallen to the dock with a crash when they'd deposited it in his hands. He'd wanted to hand it back, but they'd walked away quickly, knowing he'd probably argue their generosity. Still, he did plan to build his growing family a house someday. He'd need the funds to purchase the land and materials. Hiccup's discounts and haggling aside, he intended to do this right. Thank you, Ivan. Also. Hiccup sighed. About Genevieve and the shockjaw. Ivan shook his head. Genevieve has always been adventurous. She's caused our mother just as much grief as thuggery with his tricks and shenanigans. Finn has good instinct. He does, Eric said, tightening a strap on a saddle. He's just bad at following directions. I told him to stay out of it, Hiccup explained. Ivan sighed. Let them figure it out. You've got more important things to deal with. And frankly, I know my sister. Maybe this is the kind of adventure she needs. Hiccup nodded and rolled his eyes when Snotlout began to whine. Come on already, my buns are freezing. Snotlout, feel free to leave a few minutes before us, but I'm not leaving until I say goodbye to my son. Wherever he is. I'm sure he's avoiding you. He probably can't wait for you to leave. Eric rolled his eyes. Not a moment later, quick footfalls sounded on the deck and Finn, Helga and Thorin turned the corner. Ivan bid the others goodbye and left the docks, thick cape blowing in the wind. Helga hugged fish legs and listened to his instructions not to be too crazy with a plastered smile on her face. Eric could almost see the words going in one ear and out the other. With all of Jet to explore and Finn distracted with training, he was positive that when she wasn't helping Finn, she'd most certainly be up to no good somewhere. Well, Finn sighed, mock punching Eric in the bicep. Thanks for all the help, especially with organizing people into groups and taking notes. No problem, Eric smirked. Are you going to miss me? I expect a good birthday present when you come back. Oh yeah, I always forget your birthday is on Snoggletog. How can you forget? It's the easiest birthday to remember. Duh, because I'm obviously too busy spending each and every Snoggletog thinking about myself. I'm selfish like that. Hiccup sighed, leaning against Toothless Hide. I can't decide if I'm going to miss your sarcasm or enjoy the quiet. Please, I'll be home in a few weeks, Finn said. And besides, you're going home to Cliff, remember? Oh yes. Eric snorted. Just remember what I told you about keeping your doors locked and you'll be fine. Finn cringed. Creep. And you remember what we discussed, Eric added to Finn, shrugging his brows. It was simply unacceptable for Finn to be a scaredy cat around Genevieve, and it must be rectified as quickly as possible. His brother-in-law narrowed his eyes and seemed grateful when Hiccup changed the subject. All right, Hiccup sighed, straightening once again. Be careful, kiddo. Send us a message if you need anything important. Well, since I don't need anyone to tuck me in at night, I'm sure I'll manage. And Hiccup paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Don't do anything too stupid. Finn grinned. Crazy then. Hiccup rolled his eyes and hugged Finn tight, slapping him on the shoulder once he pulled away. Apparently he wasn't going to say anything about Genevieve and the shockjaw, which surprised Eric. With the way they'd barely spoken through dinner, he was sure a haddock argument was about to take place. Maybe Hiccup didn't want to fight with his son before leaving, or maybe he was taking Ivan's advice to let it play out. Despite Molly and Kiev's discomfort, Eric certainly couldn't deny that he'd seen something amazing take place between the soft, giant girl and the fierce, stubborn beast that was the shockjaw. Hiccup mounted Toothless, the others following suit. Eric rose into his saddle and gazed at Jet one last time, thankful that he'd gotten a chance to help train their new allies and witness their growth in the last week. The dragons rose into the air while Finn and the other two teenagers waved. Eric faced the ocean and pulled up the soft leather mask over his mouth and nose that Thorin had lent him. His heart leaped in excitement, and he was sure if the others could see his face, they'd see dimples. He couldn't wait to see Annie again and tell her all he'd seen and done this week. He couldn't wait to hear what she'd done too. He urged Charger to fly faster, and in moments they caught up with Hiccup and Toothless, who grinned back. Finally, he was heading home. Deep in the night, Adriana woke to the sound of rustling. She blearily opened her eyes to see a few bags resting by the door and blinked in confusion for a few moments. Why were there packed bags over there? And why was it so drafty and cold in here all of a sudden? She sat up, pushing a hand through her hair and looked around, confused. That's when the bed dipped behind her and she twisted, heart leaping in shock. But a smile sprang her face when she saw Eric leaning toward her, dimples and all. Hey, Eric whispered and kissed her once, twice. He brushed a hand through her bangs and down her face. Hey, Adriana said back gleefully. She threw her arms around him in a hug. "You're back." Eric laughed, burying his face in her neck. His skin and hands were like ice against her skin, and he sighed, going boneless as she dragged her hands through his hair. "I'm back." A hand rested on her belly and he pulled back ever so slightly. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Adriana said. She wanted to tell him everything that had happened this week, especially the nightmare, but by the way he smiled wanly and dropped his forehead back onto her shoulder, she could tell he was just barely hanging on to consciousness. She could wait a little longer. Slowly, she lay back down and he followed, turning so he didn't crush her or the baby. Gods, even his torso was cold. Adriana pulled 2 heavy fur blankets over top of them and Eric hummed, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her in close. "Missed you," he murmured. Adriana giggled and kissed his temple. "I missed you too. Sleep now." He was asleep in moments and she had to bite her lip to contain her squeal of happiness. He came back to her at last and before they knew it, they'd be having a baby. It had been a long, emotional week. She couldn't wait for tomorrow so they could catch up on the week's events. It was difficult and took some time of chiding herself to go back to sleep, but eventually she too dropped off, safely ensconced in her husband's arms. Eric woke slowly the next morning, perfectly warm and comfortable beneath the fur blankets. It took a few minutes to register that he was back home and smiled when he found his arms wrapped around Adriana's curvy form. With a long, contented sigh, he pulled her in closer to his chest and was perfectly content to stay like this for a while longer. A strange sensation moved along his forearm and then jabbed outward. His eyes flew open in surprise and he found his vision obscured by Adriana's long blonde hair. He gently pushed it out of his eyes and sat up to see what had been moving. He could help the smile that leapt to his face when he realized his arm had been wrapped around Adriana's baby bump. Gently, Eric rested his palm on her belly and waited. It didn't take long for the baby to move and jab outward, as if welcoming him home. He blinked in surprise. He'd only been gone 5 days but Adriana's belly almost seemed bigger already. He wasn't sure if it just seemed that way because he hadn't seen her in a few days or if she'd really grown bigger, but either way, his heart leapt in his chest. Adriana turned over with a deep inhale and stretched her arms over her head. With a sigh, she said, "You keep up with that duppy smile so early in the morning, it might just stay there forever." Eric's grin widened. "There are worse things to complain about." "Indeed," Adriana said, reaching up brush a hand through his hair. He kissed her palm and ran his hand down the length of her arm. "How'd everything go?" "Great," Eric said. "I'll tell you everything in a bit but I want to hear about you. How was your week?" Adriana's eyes dropped to their entwined hands and her lower lip stuck out slightly. "Okay." She disentangled her legs from the blankets and sat up, curling her feet beneath her. "Well, it was a fairly uneventful week. Cliff and Taryn came over a few times and we had a girls' night at my mom's. That was fun." Eric watched her fiddle with a corner of a fur blanket. "Sounds engaging." A corner of her mouth lifted in a haddock smirk. "Very engaging." "Tell me about," Eric asked. So she did. He listened while she told him about the week and he smiled in amusement when she told him about the girl's suspicions on Morgan and Evan's potential romance. He refrained from commenting on it though because something seemed off. Her green eyes usually stayed on him when they spoke and for some reason, she kept staring down at her hands, which he realized were fiddling. Instantly he reached out and took them, interrupting her speech. "Annie." Her green eyes shot up. "What?" Eric frowned. "What's the matter?" Adriana seemed to deflate slightly. "Well, I was trying to wait to tell you. Get through the good stuff first, but alas, this perceptive husband of mine just has to see right through me." He waited, knowing full well that her half attempt at jokes and self-mockery was just a cover. Something was wrong. She hadn't acted like this in months. Reaching forward, he lifted her chin to meet her eyes and stroked her cheek with his thumb. "What happened?" All humorous pretenses vanished from her face and an old fear entered her eyes. "I had a nightmare the other night." Eric's heart leapt into a gallop but he kept his expression blank. "About what?" Her hands began to tremble in his and she took a deep breath. "Brandine, and the barn." "No." Horror must have shown on his face because she squeezed his hands and slid closer. No, not that. Adriana sighed, staring at their clasped hands. I woke up before that happened. He took a long, steadying breath and relaxed his shoulders. Do you want to talk about it? Timidly, she nodded. He almost told her that she didn't have to, but he knew that locking it up inside was never a good idea. She'd probably been bursting to tell him ever since it happened and she hadn't been able to. Now that she had the chance, now that he was home, he knew they wouldn't do anything else today until she got it off her chest. I woke up in the barn, Adriana whispered. Brandine was there and... She faltered, that old terror returning to her eyes, which suddenly welled up in tears. She huffed and wiped them quickly. I didn't want to cry, why is it so hard to just get it out? Sure, it's okay, Eric said softly, hugging her quickly. He held her for a few minutes while she cried and waited patiently. She finally pulled back, her face splotchy but eyes clearer than before. Take your time. There's no rush, so tell me whenever you're ready. So she did. When the story was complete and she'd told him every moment of the nightmare, every thought that had gone through her head, she looked as if a weight had been taken off her shoulders. She'd cried a couple of times and he'd held her and wiped her tears each time. He was glad that she'd finally been able to let that burden go because it was obvious that carrying it for even a few days was too much. It left him feeling raw and guilty. You should have sent me a terror message, he said quietly. My mom wanted to, Adriana said. But I told her not to. I would have come right away, Eric said, frowning. I should have been here. It's fine, I have to be able to deal with these things. You shouldn't have to. Eric said, trying to hide the frustration rising up inside him. But just as she couldn't hide secrets from him, he couldn't hide his true feelings from her. I wasn't suffering, Adriana said, leaning over to straighten a few blankets. He tracked the movement but didn't reply. If I had gotten another one or couldn't sleep at all, I would have sent you a message. I think staying home with my mom and Cliff helped. Yes, sleeping on the couch is great for pregnancy. Eric muttered darkly. Adriana tittered, straightening once more. What's a couple of days? Clearly the little guy's okay or he wouldn't keep jabbing my impressively full bladder. Eric huffed a laugh. She poked his chest with a smile. I'm grateful for your concern though. Sighing, Eric raised her hands to his lips and kissed them chastely. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I should have been here. If it happens again, please tell me right away. Adriana nodded. I will. Now, Jet, tell me everything. Eric laughed and launched into the tale, starting with the beginning of the week and progressing in the order of events that had taken place. She was fascinated by Jet and bemoaned the fact that she would not be able to visit until after the baby was born. He was pleased to see her green eyes alight with genuine excitement, though they widened when he told her about the shock jaw. But she cackled madly when he told her about his suspicions of Finn and Genevieve. He likes her. Are you sure? Eric shrugged. I think so, but you know Finn, he's in denial. Who knows how long it will take before he's willing to admit it to himself, let alone Genevieve. Adriana clapped her hands excitedly. I may have only spoken to her for a few minutes at the wedding, but she seemed super sweet. She sighed and puckered her lips. Maybe I'll send you back so that you can play spy. Eric blinked. Why? Because how else will we know how things are progressing? I don't want to wait until Snoggletalk. Well, we're going to have to, he's not coming home before then. But you know Finn. He doesn't give details. Ah, but you see, we do have a spy already there, someone who won't hold back on the details, Eric said with a wink. Helga. Adriana's eyes danced. Oh yes. If anyone has a knack for gathering intel, it's Helga. Fear not, my sweet. Eric leaned over and dug around for his prosthetic under the bed, where it had rolled after he chucked it off last night. Helga will come through with all the juicy details. I'm not sure if it will be a better Snoggletalk for you or for me, Adriana grinned. Well, seeing as it will be my first birthday and Snoggletalk as a married man, Eric sat up, grinning. Adriana slapped his arm and stood. Finn has been a terrible influence on you, I see. Eric smirked and watched her sashay out of the bedroom. Nah, that's just married life for you. She mock gasped and wagged a finger. Naughty, naughty, Mr. Larson. Whatever shall we do with that foul mouth of yours? I'm sure I'll think of something. Adriana's eyes widened, but she turned and marched away. On that note, please hold. I have to pee. Eric laughed and tried to hide the smirk as he finished strapping on his prosthetic. Yup, newlywed life definitely had its perks. Genevieve strolled through the woods with her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. The river churned, the current quickening with the melting ice and snow. It had slowly warmed up the last couple of days, but she knew it wouldn't last. The weather always seemed to fluctuate this time of year. Thus, she would take advantage of the sunny, windless day before the rain and snow returned, forcing her to take cover inside once more. She couldn't wait until spring. Still, she pulled the chilly air deep into her lungs and exhaled heavily. Things were bound to be interesting in the coming weeks before Snoggletalk, which she'd been surprised to find the Burkians also celebrated. Perhaps it was a tradition that the Haddock and Sullivan ancestors had brought from their respective villages all those years ago. It didn't matter though. Finn planned to return to Burke before Snoggletalk. Finn hadn't said much last night after his father and Eric had left, though he did look slightly awkward at her mother's outburst. When Molly found out she'd gone into the arena with the shockjaw, well, her response was exactly what Genevieve had anticipated. So she had merely folded her hands and waited for the angry lecture to pass and nodded her understanding. She perhaps deserved it, though her father had given his permission. She'd enjoyed her brief bout of training, but Molly had fiercely told her that it wouldn't be happening again. The only time she felt true remorse was when Molly had turned to Finn. And I highly suggest that you not get any more ideas involving my daughter and that dragon. Finn's blue eyes had locked on Genevieve for the span of 2 breaths before he looked back at Molly. Yes, ma'am. She had a feeling it had taken a lot of self-control for him to say the words. Sighing, Genevieve walked down a small hill and pulled a smile onto her face at the sound of sawing. In moments the mill appeared, the wooden wheel turning and carrying water beneath the sluice. A few men noticed her strolling by and raised a hand in greeting. One of the younger men even smiled and winked as she met his gaze. She merely gave him a polite smile and kept going. Stopping to engage him in conversation would only encourage him, and she didn't feel like conversing with flirty boys at the moment. Finn had barely spoken a word even that morning, but he'd been in much higher spirits, if his charging down the stairs was any indication. Her mother had demanded to know where he was going before he grabbed the doorknob. With a cheeky grin, he replied, "Nowhere." And then he was gone, running down the street like a madman. She and Thuggery had darted to the window when they'd heard him whistle and watched in fascination as Zack plummeted from the skies, tearing after her rider until they disappeared down a bend. What must it be like to have the freedom to run out the door every day and do whatever he wanted with his time? She hadn't seen so much as a flash of blue or red since. Normally she didn't have many things to do on Saturdays, but she'd agreed to step in at the elders' home for a girl, who had apparently come down with a fierce cough. By lunch, Genevieve was ready to leave the elders and stretch her legs. Flapping caught her attention and she looked up to see a few dragons fly overhead. A quick glance over her shoulder confirmed her suspicions. A few men ran from the mill to greet the dragons as they landed, the large beasts accepting scratches on the chin. A pang of sadness hit her square in the chest and she pressed on. Feeding the shockjaw yesterday had been exciting. Thrilling almost. As much as she'd thought about training a dragon, what she would do if ever given the chance, she still had not known what to expect. She'd been nervous and jumpy, but she'd fed the shockjaw. He hadn't been alarmed at her presence. Instead, he actually seemed curious, interested. She felt a spark of pride at the thought that after all of those men tried numerous times, even the great dragon master himself, she'd been the one to feed the dragon. She wondered how well training would go now that the ice had finally been broken. If the dragon would bond with someone. She couldn't help the envious thoughts that rose up. She'd fed the dragon. She should be the one to go back in the ring with him. Finn was right. She was going back and forth with indecision. She wanted to train the shockjaw, and after yesterday's success. The snapping of a branch cracked ahead and Genevieve froze. The river still rushed at her left, so whatever it was, it had to be somewhere in the forest at her right. The foliage was dense and thick, despite the cold season. Nothing moved from what she could see. A shout of pain followed by laughter sounded, then a roar and the rush of wings. Genevieve plunged into the trees, disregarding the consequences. There wouldn't be laughter if there was something dangerous happening. Her mother would be scolding her for her recklessness. She shoved the thoughts away and stopped, the sound of her crashing through branches obscuring the location of what she sought. Up ahead she heard running and dragon growls and she edged closer on lighter feet. What she saw made her freeze. Finn leaped back as a tree branch 6 feet long nearly struck him in the chest. Zap's jaws were clamped around the wood, her growls loud and grating in the small patch of grass that offered a brief respite from the trees. Evidence of tussling was all over the surrounding trees and ground, uneven grooves in the dirt in the shape of Zap's claws. Genevieve bit back a laugh. So this is where they came to play each day. His face was red and sweaty from exertion but he didn't seem to notice. He'd discarded his coat on the ground, which lay a few feet away from where Genevieve now stood in the shadows. She briefly thought about stealing it while they were distracted. How she would tease him later about catching his death of cold. Finn dove to his stomach when Zap threw the branch at him with all her might, and Genevieve's grin dropped when it soared toward her. She gasped and barely had time to duck and cover her head before it slashed the nearby branches. It careened overhead, showering her with dead leaves, bark and twigs. Heart thundering, she looked up with wide eyes and yelped when a large blue snout was suddenly in her face. She scurried back and soon found herself pressed up against a tree trunk, pinned by Zap's blue eyes. Bark was sticking out of her lips in awkward directions and she licked her chops before cooing curiously. Zap, what are you? Finn appeared and froze. Oh. Gods, are you all right? Genevieve accepted the hand he offered and quickly brushed off her clothes. Yes, of course. I was just, she faltered at the smirk already forming on his face. Just, watching me? Finn asked. No, Genevieve was mortified by the blush that warmed her face. Well yes, but I only just arrived and I was walking nearby and heard you two and wanted to see what was happening, that's all. Good thing it was just us, Finn said, frowning at Zap's bark teeth and grabbing her by the snout. Zap tried to straighten out of his grasp with a high whine but he yanked her back down by a horn and lifted her lips. Genevieve watched in fascination as his deft fingers picked bits of wood out of her mouth. If it was a couple of wild dragons, you might be in trouble. Lucky for me, wild dragons don't laugh like crazy buffoons. Genevieve replied, smiling when his eyes narrowed. He at last released Zap's snout and she shook her head in a similar way to a dog and bounded away, chirping after her rider. Instead of following, Finn crossed his arms and faced her fully. All right, I'm a crazy buffoon. He leaned in close enough that she could nearly count the freckles dotting his nose. But at least I'm not nosy. With a laugh he turned and walked away, leaving her gaping. I'm not nosy, Genevieve said, striding after him. Zap was wiggling in excitement as Finn grabbed a much smaller stick and threw it across the clearing. No. Finn asked. You can't go a day without watching me. I finally get a day off and you still manage to track me down. Genevieve blinked, willing herself not to blush again. This was pure coincidence. Just admit it, Finn chortled, seemingly unaware as Zap returned and dropped the stick at his feet. You find me irresistible. Rolling her eyes, Genevieve replied, and here I thought you were different. Finn snorted. The only difference between me and your Jatan boys is when I need an escape, I have a dragon to get me there. Everything else. He tsked and threw the stick once more. Probably the same. And you're the future chief of Burke. Genevieve pointed out. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Right. She wondered at his response. Does that bother you? Being chief someday? Finn asked, once again oblivious to Zap's return. She nosed the stick closer to him and gave a stout aroof when it went unheeded. No, I mean, he shrugged. It's a lot of responsibility. Hopefully it won't happen anytime soon. Genevieve smiled. Well, if it's any consolation, you're doing a great job at dragon training. I've learned a lot just by watching. The smile he gave her this time was softer, gentler. One she hadn't seen on him yet. Speaking of, Genevieve added, smoothing some of the dirt at her feet when she realized she was standing on an uneven patch created by Zap's claws. The dragon began bounding around her rider, yipping and panting, but he paid her no heed. Genevieve pushed away her nerves when she realized his full attention was on her. She stopped fiddling with the dirt. "Thank you for the little impromptu lesson yesterday. But maybe a little more warning next time." Finn winced. "Yeah, I was kind of instructed not to bring you into the arena at all." "Really?" "Yes," Finn sighed, pushing Zap's nose away when she shoved her head underneath his arm. She growled in reply, slapping her tail on the ground. Genevieve bit back a grin but willed herself to focus on his words. "My dad didn't want me to get involved in any potential, civil disputes." Genevieve pursed her lips, glancing at the annoyed Shockjaw once more when she growled. Still, Finn ignored her. "It seems you've flung the door wide open instead." "Yeah, sometimes I can't resist the urges, what can I?" Finn suddenly yelped and was launched upwards. Zap had finally had enough of being ignored, it seemed. She darted back and thrust her head between his legs, launching him high onto her neck and demanding to be attended to. He careened to the side, barely catching himself on her horns. "You big baby, I'm having a conversation." Genevieve grinned, watching as he righted himself on the dragon's neck and began scratching her neck. Zap cooed and closed her eyes, preening at last at the attention. "Sorry," Finn said. "She's a needy little thing." "It's all right, though I'd hardly call her little," Genevieve said, watching as Zap opened her eyes and looked down at her. Bending slightly, the dragon sniffed her hair and ear, making Genevieve giggle and duck away. "Stop, that tickles. Why do they all keep smelling my hair?" "Must be something in your shampoo," Finn said. "Even I have to admit it smells nice." Genevieve blinked up at him in surprise. He seemed to realize what he'd said and winced. Okay, two could play. She had to admit, she liked him blushing and decided to press her advantage. "And when, pray tell, have you had the chance to notice?" Finn cleared his throat and scratched his neck. Oh yes, she was enjoying this. "Well, yesterday. At the arena." Her mirth evaporated. When the male Shockjaw had been sniffing for more fish and she'd backed into Finn's chest. Twice. Suddenly, she too felt embarrassed and looked away, wondering if perhaps she shouldn't have spoken. Now they both felt awkward. Thankfully, Zap saved them both by leaning closer with a coo. Genevieve could see her reflection in the Shockjaw's crystalline eyes and she stared back in amazement. "Want to pet her?" Finn asked. Genevieve glanced up at him. After yesterday, she shouldn't. She'd started wondering if maybe she should stop going to the arena altogether. It was only causing her grief both at home and in her soul. How long could she keep torturing herself with things she couldn't have? But she wanted to. Gods, she wanted to. Slowly, she lifted a hand toward the dragon. She waited for Finn to instruct her differently, to change her pose or demeanor, but he didn't say a word. Zap stood still and silent, staring at her palm. What did the dragon see as her pupils dilated? Did she see the callus on her fingertips from hours of knitting, sewing and plucking harp strings? Did she see smooth skin, unmarred by weapons and dragon scales? With the silence of a whisper, Zap pressed her nose to Genevieve's palm. She flinched on instinct and stared, shocked that it was happening. The same as it had with Toothless, though his nose was soft and velvety, not unlike a horse's nose. Zap's nose was moist and smooth, like wet silk. Giggling, Genevieve stroked the dragon's nose as she'd seen Finn do numerous times. Zap cooed and stepped closer, nearly bumping into her chest. Finn gave one of her horns a gentle tug. "Easy, Zap." Genevieve pet both sides of the dragon's face and scratched beneath her jaw. Zap purred and closed her eyes, one of her wings slowly drooping to the ground. "Who's a pretty girl?" Genevieve whispered. She looked up at Finn and saw him leaning into a hand, watching from his perch with a contemplative look. "What?" He shook his head. "You surprise me, that's all." Genevieve brushed a few bits of bark away from Zap's lips and winced when her hand came back covered in drool. She bent to wipe it on the grass and asked, "Why?" "What do you mean?" Finn dismounted, adjusting his rumpled shirt once he hit the ground. "I don't know. You just don't strike me as a girl who likes to have adventures, I guess." Giggling in amusement, Genevieve straightened, finally resolving to wipe her hands on her coat. Finn tracked the movement but didn't speak further. I like to have adventures, Finn. The problem is I'm not allowed to embark on them very often. And sadly she sighed, looking down to inspect her still grimy hands. My window on potential adventures is closing rapidly. What do you mean? I mean, I'll be 18 next October, and with that comes engagement for eligible Jatan girls. She replied primly, gauging his expression. Finn seemed to stare back. Whether he was choosing his words carefully or warring within himself at the idea, for she'd figured out long ago that Burkians didn't marry off their girls right when they came of age at 17, a full year younger than the Jatans, she couldn't tell. But it was nearly a minute before he replied, I see. She wasn't sure what she had wanted him to say, but it wasn't that. Though maybe, as he'd stated earlier, he was just trying to stay on neutral ground. After all, his task was to teach her people how to train dragons, not get involved in Jatan civil disputes, as he'd called it. He lifted a hand and pointed at her. You've got a... Genevieve blinked when he reached forward and she felt something coming loose from her hair. He twirled a dry leaf in his hands before he let it fall to the ground. Thank you. He nodded and shoved his hands into his pockets. Well, he said suddenly, blue eyes alight with mischief. You do owe me a tour. Someone has to know where all the best digs are. Digs? Finn snickered. Never mind. I don't know what your schedule is, but I'm free all day. Oh, I am too, Genevieve nodded. Suddenly the thought of spending the rest of the day with Finn and Zach filled her with excitement. Her thoughts bounced from idea to idea on all the places he'd likely not yet seen. She landed on one in particular and smiled. How would you like to see my favorite place on Jat? His eyes landed on hers and her heart stuttered. So blue, so open. So free. Lead the way. When Finn followed her through the woods for miles, he briefly considered offering a ride on Zach to save time. His dragon had taken to exploring the nearby ravines before she'd taken to the air. He knew that if he needed her, his whistle would carry and she'd come quickly. But he considered the wisdom of flying when 1. Genevieve was currently dressed in a blue frock and a slimming black coat, and 2. She'd never actually flown before. He bit his tongue and continued following her through the woods. As time passed, however, he began to wonder how she wasn't freezing or exhausted yet. She had told him that she liked exercising though. Perhaps she took mile-long hikes often. She did seem to be busy most days, and while she might follow him around and know his schedule, he did not know hers. And he wasn't about to start following her around to find out either. Besides, he didn't mind that she kept popping up randomly in his day. It seemed he didn't need to go looking for her. Still, after hiking steadily upwards into the mountains, traveling far from the village and plunging deeper into the forest, Finn started to wonder where exactly she was taking him. But badgering her every few minutes had proven worthless. Every time, she'd turn one of those dazzling smiles at him and effectively turn his insides to jelly. He'd been kicking himself for the better half of the hike for the comment on her hair. When she'd shied away from the male shockjaw and pressed up against him, it had taken him a minute to realize that Kiev might not appreciate that. The retired chief hadn't mentioned it to him yet, so maybe he'd understood that it was innocent enough. Still, he needed to keep in mind that the Jatans were so proper it would probably put Tarin Brown's parents to shame. He'd hate for someone to question Genevieve's conduct because they returned to the village together. He paused at the thought, wondering once again where she was taking him. Genevieve also paused a few feet ahead, panting slightly from the rocky climb. Getting tired? I thought you had more endurance than this. To be fair, I played with Zach for 2 hours before you showed up, but no, I'm not tired, Finn said, easily catching up. I have a question actually. I told you, you're going to have to wait and see. No, not that, Finn snickered but brushed aside the humor. He had to know. Are you going to get in trouble for being alone with me? Genevieve blinked, her dark eyes widening. Why would you think that? We're all still getting to know each other, Finn said, turning and gazing at the tall trees around them. They were high enough that he could vaguely see the plumes of chimney smoke from the village and the ocean beyond. I'm as untraditional as they come, and I guess I just don't want you to get in trouble because I crossed some line. To his surprise, Genevieve rose to her full height, which barely grazed his chin. If anyone had a problem, their problem would be with me. We have our laws and expectations, but I hope they wouldn't hold you to such high standards when you're not from here. Well, other than human decency, Finn said. I can promise you that much. Yes. Anyway, you're right, we don't know each other that well, Genevieve said. But I trust you. You haven't given us any reason to think otherwise. Jattis. She rolled her eyes. A bit stiff sometimes. I may be one of the few that wishes to see it grow past its small-minded ways. But I hope that people trust both of us to know that we took a hike to the mountains and nothing more. Finn gulped at that terrifying four-letter word. More. But he nodded resolutely and smiled. Okay. I'm glad we got that settled. Genevieve giggled. Were you seriously worried? Finn shrugged. Maybe a little. I guess in light of recent events and past events, he didn't need to add, I'm just a little more sensitive to it. Genevieve simpered and nodded. I appreciate you asking. It doesn't hurt to err on the side of caution. But anyway, she brandished a hand behind her. We've arrived. Stepping closer, Finn gazed down a short ravine and marveled at the large black hole that plunged deep into the belly of the mountain. He peered at Genevieve in surprise. A cave. You brought me all this way to explore a cave. Genevieve slapped his bicep. Don't ruin it. Finn laughed as she slowly descended the boulders and he quickly followed, hopping down the biggest of them and offering her assistance down. She planted her palms on his shoulders while he gripped her waist and eased her down, marveling at her slim waist beneath his palms. Her feet touched the ground and he found himself staring, nearly standing nose to nose. She stared back unblinkingly and then gave him a slow, sweet smile. Too fast. He retracted his hands and stepped away, hopping down to peer into the caves. So, be honest, he pulled up every reserve of cocky bravado he could muster to calm the fire in his veins. Did you drag me out here to wrangle a whispering death? Genevieve blinked with what he sincerely hoped was confusion and not dismay at his sudden retreat. What's a whispering death? Nasty dragon that digs tunnels underground, Finn replied, leaning against the opening and peering in. Dozens of rows of razor-sharp teeth, a splitting roar, not the friendliest of foes. They'd make the male shockjaw look like an old friend. He smirked and found her staring at him with a small, unsure smile. He swallowed hard. Genevieve seemed to shake off whatever she was thinking. No. If there are any dragons in there, they just moved in. I was here last week. Completely dragon-free. I'll hold you to that. Careful, it's slippery, Genevieve warned before stepping inside. As they descended into the darkness, Finn gazed at the walls and wondered what with all the beauty outside, this was her favorite location. Genevieve approached a torch in a nearby sconce and picked up a piece of flint. He watched her try to light it for nearly a minute before stepping closer. Here, let me. Genevieve smiled gratefully and handed him the flint. It took him 3 tries and finally flames crackled to life, lighting the torch. She pulled it out of the sconce in the wall and took his hand, her palm small but firm in his own. Stay close, she said, grinning with excitement. I wouldn't want you to break an ankle. He breathed a laugh and did as instructed. For your sake, I hope not. Imagine having to carry me back to the village. People might start to think you're a bit accident-prone. Finn guffawed, earning another bright smile from her. You're slowly figuring me out, General. I'd hoped so. She didn't see the way he grinned in that moment, what with her walking slightly ahead of him and keeping an eye on the rocky path. But gods, when he met Genevieve for the first time at Eric and Adriana's wedding, he had no idea that the beautiful, witty, curly-haired blonde would someday be leading him into the deep, dark recesses of the earth where the light couldn't reach to see whatever it was she wanted him to see. The torchlight flickered across the walls, casting their shadows around them. Dust kicked up from their boots as they walked, tickling their noses. The temperature dropped and a shiver crawled up Finn's spine when they came upon a set of buckets and tools, including chisels and axes. Suddenly, his breath caught and he screeched to a halt. Cold chains clinked at his wrists and the tang of blood filled his nose, the wounds on his back tearing open with each strike of the cane. He choked on the dust that floated up from the cave floor as the roof caved in. The walls pressed in on all sides and he was lost in the dark. No one was coming, no one was coming. His back hit the stone wall and he flinched, returning to the present. He found his breath coming in short gasps. Genevieve had dropped the torch and was standing in front of him with wide eyes. "Finn, what's wrong?" "Nothing, just give me a minute." He brushed past her and shoved his shaking hands into his hair, breathing slowly and deeply through his nose and out his mouth. Gods, he hadn't had a flashback that vivid in years. Not since Binnen died. He clutched the necklace under his coat and willed himself to breathe slower. Genevieve stepped in front of him again, nothing but concern on her face. Her eyes darted to his neck for a brief moment. "What's wrong?" Hysteria shot up his throat for a moment and he clamped it down. She'd been so excited to show him something and he wasn't going to ruin it for her. He hadn't been in a single cave since he'd been a slave, so he had not anticipated this happening. He could do this. "I'm okay," he breathed, wiping his forehead on his sleeve and offering her a tight smile. "Really, I'm all right." "You don't look all right," Genevieve said. "You look like you're about to have a panic attack." Finn huffed a laugh and rubbed his face. "Okay." His heart hammered in his chest. "I don't have great experiences with caves." At her alarmed look, he quickly added, "But it was 10 years ago, and I promise you, I haven't been in a cave since. I had no idea this was going to happen. Gods, this is so stupid." He finished with an embarrassed laugh, earning him a small, but still concerned smile. "Should we go back to the surface?" "No." Despite his discomfort, he could handle this. He'd deal with his apparent trauma coming back to haunt him later, but for now, he could do this. He had to do this. Besides, there were plenty of things that still terrified his dad and he was chief. He had to push aside those fears to do what needed to be done. An extreme example when this situation wasn't so imperative, but no, he was not about to let this ruin his first day out with Genevieve, growing friendship or more or whatever it was aside. "Are you sure?" Genevieve asked. Finn nodded. He found himself still gripping his necklace and forced himself to relax his fist. As he dropped his hand, Genevieve stared at his chest. Her dark eyes flicked back to his briefly before she took his hand once more, thankfully no longer shaking. "If you change your mind, I want you to tell me. Promise me." "I promise," Finn said, then added wistfully, "and I'm sorry." Genevieve pushed a hand onto his mouth, effectively cutting off his words. "Don't apologize. It's okay." He nodded, gratefully. She bent and picked up the torch, which thankfully still burned. Finn slowly exhaled, steeling his nerves as they pressed on, Genevieve keeping a firm grip on his hand this time. He didn't feel as shaken now that the worst had passed. "What is this place?" Finn asked finally, as they passed the buckets and work tools. He didn't so much as look at them when they walked by. He swallowed, almost afraid of the answer. "It's a mine," Genevieve said. "Well, an old mine, they don't use this one as much anymore. But soon you'll see why it's my favorite place." Finn huffed a laugh. "Yeah, I'm sure I've put a damper on that." "Don't be silly," Genevieve said, squeezing his hand gently. They carried on in silence until she began to hum. The soft, pure notes echoed across the walls and down the cavern. Finn found himself drawn to her voice, just as he had the first time he'd heard her sing. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was his fear. But he found himself relaxing even as they plunged deeper into the cave. Finally, their steps echoed into a vast chamber that opened high above them. Genevieve sighed and squeezed his hand gently before dropping it and walking to a tall brick and mortar furnace. Dropping the end of the torch into a hole at the top, flames leapt to life and shot down a small ravine. Finn recognized the smell almost instantly. "Oil." "Yes," Genevieve said, smiling as they watched the fire spread in a thin line around the room. "But wouldn't that fill the chamber up with smoke?" Finn asked, pointing at the center. "What I was told is the oil burns low enough that the smoke quickly dissipates and clears out. There are enough tunnels attached that it happens quickly. Plenty of air. I've come here numerous times and have never had an issue." "Interesting," Finn said. Genevieve giggled. I didn't bring you here to show you the miner's engineering skills. I came to show you that. She pointed up and Finn blinked in shock at the sight of glittering stones embedded in the rock high above them. Diamonds. Thousands of them, Genevieve breathed. Like stars in the night sky. The fire sent amber-colored light up the cave walls, causing the diamonds to glitter and shine in every direction he looked. He had to admit that it was beautiful, and it would be for a girl who had very little opportunity to see the world. But all he could think of was chipping at the walls to harvest the diamond. Of that man beside him whose tongue had been cut out. He found himself reaching up to grab his necklace again. Genevieve noticed, and he covered by reaching up to rub his neck, though he knew she wasn't fooled. Well, she began, turning back to the opening. Why is this your favorite place? Finn asked suddenly. Genevieve pursed her lips. Well, sometimes I come here to get away from the mundane day-to-day life. Sometimes I sing to pass the time. Finn looked at her in surprise. In here? She nodded. The acoustics are amazing. Blinking, he couldn't help the smile. What? Huffing playfully, she grabbed his arm. Oh, sit down. He dropped onto a crate and folded his hands, glancing around the cavern with an amused smile, unsure what to expect. Whenever the Jatans began speaking about music, he was quickly lost. Genevieve sat beside him on another crate and cleared her throat. Close your eyes. Finn raised his brows. Naughty things happen when one tells a boy to close. Oh, shut up and close them if you want to know what acoustics are. Chuckling, Finn complied. And why must I close my eyes? It will make the experience better for you. Well, if you say. Sure, I need to think. Finn shut his mouth for good this time, still unsure what to expect. For nearly a minute, the room was silent except for the sound of fire crackling gently from all corners. He heard Genevieve inhale, and then her voice filled the chamber in full, echoing waves. A king he was on carven throne. In many-pillared halls of stone. With golden roof and silver floor. And runes of power upon the door. The light of sun and star and moon. In shining lamps of crystal hewn. Undimmed by cloud or shade of night. There shone forever fair and bright. Unable to resist any longer, Finn opened his eyes when she continued, finding her eyes closed as she sang. The world is grey, the mountains old. The forge's fire is ashen cold. No harp is rung, no hammer falls. The darkness dwells in Durin's halls. The shadow lies upon his tomb. In Moria, in Khazad-dûm. But still the sunken stars appear. In dark and windless Miromir. There lies his crown in water deep. Till Durin wakes again from sleep. She kept her eyes closed, even after the last note dissipated into the cavern. Finn stared shamelessly, even when she finally opened her eyes and gazed at him with a soft smile. Acoustics. Genevieve waved a hand through the air. Some rooms have what we call better acoustics, as opposed to other rooms. Like if you were to sing in your room, square, basic, your voice wouldn't really go anywhere. But in an echoing chamber like this, it flows and builds. She sighed happily. Singing in a place like this is magical. Finn whispered. She smiled at him, perhaps a bit shyly if her gaze dropping to her boots was any indication. So, yes, this is my favorite place on Jat to date. It's beautiful, Finn said, gazing around the room once more. This time, he didn't feel discomfort. Now he understood. Thank you for showing me. Genevieve nodded and stood. Well, we should probably head back. Yes, probably. Finn helped her with a metal grating system that covered the flames and cooled down the small forge that kept the coals hot, which wasn't altogether different from the one he used at the forge on Burke. Once that was taken care of, he picked up the torch and offered his arm. No breaking ankles, Jen, I'd hate to have to carry you back. Genevieve giggled and took his arm, and together they walked back to the surface. Genevieve noticed that Finn breathed easier once they saw daylight spilling into the cave entrance. They stepped into the sun and brushed off their clothes, dust covering her skirt and his pants. She gave a shrug of indifference when a few swats did not seem to lift it. She started the climb back up the ravine and Finn clambered after her, offering her a hand once he'd reached the top of the incline. So how often do you come out here then? As often as I can, she replied, accepting his hand and thankful for his seemingly endless strength. She'd taken a tumble off this incline once a year ago and was lucky to have not broken something. Gesturing forward, she took a different turn than the way they'd come, hoping to show him one more of her favorite places. By the time they arrived back at the village, it might very well be dinner time. All the hustle and bustle of the village gets a little overwhelming sometimes. I like to come out here to think and have some time to myself. Me too, actually, Finn said, shoving his hands into his pockets as they walked. Except my disappearing into the woods is usually less walking and more running or axe throwing. Yet I imagine you return to the village less stressed. Most of the time. So what do you do for fun on Berk that doesn't involve dragons or weapons? Genevieve asked teasingly. You dare insinuate that there's more to life than dragons and weaponry? Finn demanded. She'd never bandied words so easily with anyone as she did with Finn. As they walked, they bantered until she finally managed to extract a few more kernels of information out of him. He enjoyed the outdoors and his favorite season was autumn when the weather was cool and the heat of the forge was a comfort. He'd traveled all over the archipelago, even accompanying his father on chiefly meetings when he was 13. She refrained from asking about the cave, as much as she was itching to. It was obvious that something had happened in his life to make him suddenly seize up like that. She hadn't known him long, but if someone had told her yesterday that fearless Finn would have some kind of meltdown, she might have laughed. After seeing him handle numerous dragon skirmishes this week, especially with the Shockjaw, she'd seen him as nothing but fearless, brave and strong. But when his breath had hitched and he'd gone rigid, staring at the tools with a look akin to horror, she'd called his name twice and he'd only backed away, his breath escalating. The terror in his blue eyes had revealed something that was clearly cut deep. And as much as she craved to ask, she kept her mouth firmly clamped shut. She would not got asking about it. Not to him anyway. There was something else she was curious about though. Have to admit that outside of work and training, I don't really do much. I can't say I have much of a hobby otherwise. Well, Finn paused. I guess I whittle now and then. Genevieve stepped around a rather large tree trunk, conveniently stepping in his path. Really? What do you whittle? Finn breathed a laugh. I don't know, it's just a calming activity. I don't really do it consistently. No? Genevieve asked, slowing to a stop and staring briefly at his chest. He gave her a small, lazy smile. Her heart leapt at her sudden bravery, but she forced herself to smile as she crawled her fingertips up his chest and over his shoulder, reveling in the way his eyebrows suddenly lifted. Not even to make jewelry. Her fingertips brushed the nape of his neck ever so slightly, but she victoriously grabbed the worn leather strap peeking above his collar and pulled the necklace out from underneath his shirt. A small wooden carving rested at the base of his throat with a single Latin word inscribed, Fortis. Finn's pleased amusement had fallen away instantaneously, though he didn't look upset. No, I don't make jewelry. Genevieve flushed, suddenly feeling like she'd overstepped a line. She dropped the cord and watched the necklace slide back down his chest. Sorry, He smiled in amusement. See? I told you you're nosy. A breathy laugh escaped her and she covered her face briefly. It was so warm all of a sudden, she almost wanted to take her coat off. Jen, it's fine, Finn said, pulling the strap up and over his head. He held out the necklace. Here, you can look at it. Still slightly embarrassed, she winced. Are you sure? If I wasn't, I wouldn't have taken it off. Finn said, his hand still outstretched. Relieved but trying not to appear too eager, Genevieve took the necklace. The leather strap was soft and worn, clearly something he never took off. The carving was from oak, yellowed with age and whittled down into a near-perfect square. Fortis had been inscribed in the center with a precise hand. Strong, Genevieve translated, looking up at him through her bangs. Surprise flashed in his eyes briefly. You know Latin? I took lessons as a child, she replied, handing the necklace back and watched as he put it back on. You keep it close. Finn inhaled deeply. It's the last thing Benin ever gave me. Did he speak Latin? Genevieve asked. Fluently. I didn't realize Burkians spoke Latin. A flare of something she couldn't place entered his eyes. Benin wasn't from Burke. Where else are we going? Finn interrupted. Though he was smiling in amusement, clearly he didn't want to talk about Benin. Nosy, indeed. My second favorite place, Genevieve said, turning and marching forward. She kicked herself mentally for all her constant questions, wondering why she couldn't just put a cork in it for once. Are we going to carry on down the list? Only if you wish. As long as we don't miss dinner, I'm good. Genevieve rolled her eyes. No wonder you and Thuggery get along so well. We strapping boys must feast together. It's a game really to see who can eat the most without puking. You kidding? Finn laughed. It would be a disgrace to have such a low countenance. Genevieve sighed and shook her head in amusement. She'd never understand boys. Within minutes they exited the forest and found themselves at a cliff's edge. A few sparse trees dotted the area with a large stone that served as a seating area. Relieved, Genevieve hopped onto it with a sigh. Her feet were starting to hurt. Finn walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the impressive drop. The wind tousled his hair as he faced her with a knowing smile. I take it the acoustics aren't so good up here. Genevieve giggled. No, decidedly not. Finn joined her on the rock and leaned back on his palms with a sigh. Well, I have to say you have good taste in second favorite locations. Rolling her eyes, she shook her head. If he had any meltdowns at this one, surely there'd be no recovering herself. He'd never leave the village with her again. I wish I'd known caves made you uncomfortable, or I would have reconsidered. I'm sorry. Finn shook his head. Don't be. Like I said, I didn't expect that to happen. Unwilling to make a fool of herself further, she didn't push the topic. They sat in quiet silence for a while, eyes on the sky and distant ocean. She stared at the horizon, marveling as she usually did at how far it went, how her eyes simply weren't strong enough to see farther. How far could she go in any one direction before she hit land? Did lands exist that weren't islands, where the earth stretched for miles and miles and miles in any direction? What sort of people lived there? What are you thinking about? She found him watching her closely, expression open. She faced the ocean again and sighed. Distant lands. Ah. What's it like? Genevieve blurted, facing him once more. His brows shot upward. What's what like? She hoped she didn't sound ridiculous or petty. That he wouldn't think of her as childish or selfish. Freedom. His brow wrinkled, but not in the way she expected. He stared at her for nearly a minute with that soft, analyzing expression that she still couldn't place. Finally, he swallowed and asked, define freedom. Genevieve looked back at the water. He wanted her to define freedom. Did she mean it like having the freedom to do as she wished whenever she wanted? Did it mean being free of her parents' rigid standards? Did it mean freeing herself from her people's traditions and having no say in what she did with her life? No. Yes, those things were true, but no. I want more out of life than sitting idly by, she said carefully. Life is precious and it only happens once. I don't want to look back as an old woman and see that all I ever did was go with the flow, stick to the status quo. I want to learn new things and take life by the horns and live it. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the fierce desire that threatened to burst in her chest at the words. Words she'd hardly dare admit to herself, let alone speak out loud. The way I see you and dragons, your dad, your friends, your lives are big and wild and epic. Things I've only ever read about. I guess now that I see an opportunity available to me, now that I see that things can be different, if I fight hard enough for it, it makes me not want to settle for less. Silence took over the cliff as the wind swallowed her words. She chanced a nervous look and found him still staring, but this time with a small, proud smile. Unsure what else to say, she giggled and shrugged. There we have it, I guess. Wordlessly, he placed 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled shrilly. She winced and blinked in surprise, confused when he finally dropped his hand. A roar sounded across the hills, but his eyes stayed on hers as Zack cleared the tree line. The wind shooting up the cliff billowed her wings and she soared higher before turning and diving toward them. Zack touched down, wings flapping to slow her landing. Still smiling, Finn stood and greeted her, giving her a firm pat on the shoulder. Genevieve watched in confusion as he adjusted the saddle straps. Her heart twisted in her chest suddenly. Maybe her words had merely amused him, and now that she'd said them out loud and spent a few hours with her, he was finally ready to return to the village. And make her walk back alone apparently. Instead, Finn faced her with an ever-growing smile. The choice is yours, General. Are you going to live by the status quo, or are you going to take life by the horns and live it? Genevieve blinked. His smile was full of challenge. Was he insinuating that he wanted her to make a decision right now? Well, hang on, my parents can be convinced, Finn said firmly. They are good people and they love you. Stop worrying about what other people think, Genevieve, and start listening to yourself. What do you want? She stared at him, heart thundering. That daring smirk, those eyes narrowed with challenging amusement. What do I want? Her eyes trailed to Zap, who stood at attention patiently, surprisingly still. As if she understood the importance of this moment. That old longing she'd felt for weeks rose up, and it was all she could do to keep her voice steady as she said, I want to fly. Finn's grin was victorious. Then get on. Genevieve's heart launched into a gallop as he turned and mounted Zap. They trotted toward her and she hopped up from her seat, staring up at them. Zap yapped at her excitedly, clearing eager to get going. Right now. Genevieve squeaked. There's no time like the present, Finn said, holding out a hand. Heart thundering, Genevieve stared at his hand and then up at him. He exuded a confidence that she'd never seen anyone carry before, almost like a second skin. Perhaps it was time for her to make a choice, stick to the status quo or take a leap of faith and see where it took her. Slowly, as if in a trance, she took his hand and he gently pulled her closer. Zap remained still as Finn instructed her on how to mount, which she vaguely thought wasn't all too different from mounting a horse. She felt slightly awkward when she sat directly behind him, her legs nearly straddling his. She'd never been this close to a boy physically before. Yet he seemed unfazed as he guided her legs into the straps attached to the saddle and she tucked her long skirt underneath them. At least he was in front of her, so there would be no accidents, right? Finn smiled over his shoulder and she gulped. Okay Zap, let's go. Zap turned toward the lip of the cliff and Genevieve gasped, latching onto Finn's torso in sudden terror. Oh gods, oh gods, oh gods. Finn laughed and patted her wrist. Relax, we haven't even started yet. You'll deserve it if I throw up on you. He laughed again, which she felt in the muscles of his chest and stomach. Through the haze of fear she felt the corded muscles of his chest under her hands. The thought disappeared in a fleeting moment when Zap reached the edge. Genevieve felt the briefest sigh of relief at the beautiful view, not all too different from her perch on the stone behind her. Oh well, that's not so bad. Zap crouched and leaned forward, tipping them nearly straight down, and opened her wings. Her relief crumbled as she stared down the cliff face that plummeted straight down and watched as a loose pebble tumbled into the abyss. Genevieve gasped and clung onto Finn for dear life, especially as he cackled madly. With a lunge, Zap tipped downward and Genevieve felt her body becoming weightless before. A scream shattered from her throat as they dove, the earth and sea and sky blurring into one. The wind pulled at her entire being, ripping her hair from its braid and threatening to yank her out of the saddle. She clung to Finn with every ounce of strength she had until finally, Zap's wings caught an updraft and they shot forward. Finn was still laughing, nearly doubled over. Genevieve, open your eyes. No. Open your eyes. Genevieve buried her face in his spine and shook her head, wondering what in the gods' names she'd been thinking when she agreed to this. The wind howled in her ears and they popped with the sudden drop in pressure. She could feel the dragon's muscles shifting beneath her with every flap of the mighty wings. Zap roared, the sound making her bones shudder within her. Genevieve's heart thundered in her chest so hard, she thought it might burst out of her chest. She almost didn't want to know how fast they were going. Then again. Now that the initial terror had worn off, she felt herself smiling. Slowly she opened her eyes and gasped. The ocean was a blur beneath them, waves crashing and sending spray upwards. She took a deep breath of salty air and chanced a glance down, seeing Zap's reflection on the waves. She saw herself staring back, dark eyes wide, curls billowing in the wind, and a wide grin on her face. "Oh God," she murmured, sitting back up as Zap pumped her wings, lifting them higher into the air. They rose until the water fell away and her eyes began to stream from the cold air. Though the idea of being up so high sounded terrifying, she couldn't close her eyes as the sky opened up around her. Zap suddenly banked left and Finn shouted, "Lean." Genevieve obliged and found it better to follow Zap's movements than fight for the center of gravity. Up here, she wasn't in control. She yelped when she felt herself sliding and Finn patted her bare knee, sitting up slightly when Zap leveled out. "Relax, you're strapped in." Genevieve gaped at the sight of her skirt lifted slightly above her knees and the fact that he'd just touched her bare skin, but she shook it off. It was a knee. They all had them. She would not let her prudish upbringing ruin this moment. Focusing on his words, she replied, "Well, you're not. I'm the professional, I know what to do if I fall." Genevieve panted through her clenched teeth. "I don't." Finn laughed and he patted Zap on the neck. "Nice and easy, Zappy." Zap crooned and flapped once more, leveling out. Soon their flight felt more like a flawless glide, an occasional wing bit all that was needed to keep them in the sky. As they passed through the thick cloud cover, she was covered in a cold sensation that made her press her face into his back again. Moments later, she gasped as the cloud cover broke to reveal endless miles of open sky awash in hues of gold and pink. Genevieve's fingers began to cramp with the strength she was holding Finn, but he didn't complain. Zap banked, ducking under a large fluffy cloud. She stared up at it in shock, and willed herself to be brave as she slowly removed a hand from Finn's waist to touch it. It felt like cold mist and she was shocked to find her hand covered in water when she lowered it. "Water," she breathed. "The clouds are made of water." "Amazing, huh?" Finn asked, turning a look over his shoulder. A gap in the clouds broke and Genevieve suddenly found herself staring straight down at the ocean, which appeared to be miles and miles away. With a gasp, she faced forward and instinctively grabbed Finn's waist again. He laughed and patted her arm. "I'm not going to let you fall. If you do, I'll never ride again." Now what is it they say about falling off horses? The ground isn't 1,000 miles away when you're on a horse. Genevieve cried. Try again," Finn replied as if he hadn't heard her shout. She slapped his side and he jerked, causing Zap to lurch in her flight. They quickly leveled out but she couldn't help the question. "Are you hurt?" Genevieve asked. "No, just an old wound that flared up this week. I'm all right," Finn replied. "What old wound?" "Nothing." "Oh look. Jet!" Finn cried. Genevieve looked down in time to see the clouds part. Her home island appeared, a beautiful white tundra on the ocean with its horseshoe-shaped harbor and rolling hills. Spray from the waterfall could be seen even from this distance and she could just barely see the smoke from the village. She found herself grinning and pressed her cheek into Finn's shoulder as they slowly descended. "Not all flying is fancy tricks," Finn said softly. "Sometimes it's this. The wind in your face and so cold you can barely feel your hands, but complete silence. No one around but you and your dragon. There's no place like the sky, where you're free as the wind." Her heart soared. From up here, she could see farther and wider than her little cliff, than any ship in her brother's fleet. The ocean and sky stretched for countless miles in every direction. And up here the rules were simple. It was her and nature. The only thing that mattered was staying aloft and not plummeting to her death, but the odds of that happening were slim with Finn and Zap in control. No parents, no village, no responsibilities. Just her and the wind calling her name. Smiling into his shoulder, Genevieve asked, "How far do you think it goes?" "The world?" Finn asked, his hair tickling her forehead when he followed her line of sight. "Pretty far. Who knows? Would you travel to find out?" "No," Finn said easily. "I've seen enough of the world to know where my place is, and that's on Burke." Curiosity rose in her throat but she clamped it down. She'd asked him enough prying questions for one day. "Well, I'd like to think that someday you'll make an amazing chief," Genevieve said, patting his arm. Stealing her nerves, she leaned to the side to pat Zap's side. She could feel the heat of the dragon's muscles working in tandem. She briefly wondered what the membranous wings felt like but returned her hand to Finn's waist. She didn't want to distract Zap as they flew. With a sigh, Genevieve pressed her cheek to Finn's back and stared at the sky. For a while they flew on a gentle wind, Zap swooping past clouds. It was some time before Genevieve realized the sky had begun to change colors. As the sky transitioned from a bright pink to a soft lavender, Zap slowly began her descent. They glided most of the way, taking their time as Jet slowly grew larger. At long last they found the clearing she'd found Finn and Zap at earlier. Zap back flapped, the grass and brush blowing with the force. Genevieve clung to Finn as she found herself nearly tipping backwards. Finally the dragon landed on all fours and tucked in her wings, cooing her exhaustion. Genevieve gazed at the leather straps tying her calves into the saddle and watched as Finn made quick work loosening them. What is the purpose of these, anyway? Well, Zap can be a little crazy with her flight patterns, Finn replied. After almost losing me in the air a few times, I decided to make a few adjustments. So if we plan on any fast flying, I strap my legs in for reinforcement. Ah, that makes sense. Finn loosened the remaining straps and she carefully pulled her legs out, adjusting her skirt once they were free. She sighed, rolling her ankles at the sudden tingling in her limbs. He lifted one leg over Zap's head and dropped to the ground before reaching up to grip her by the waist. Careful, he said as she clambered down, palms on his shoulders. First flights tend to disorient you a little bit. As predicted, her knees nearly buckled once she touched the ground. Thankfully he kept her from falling on her face and held her waist until she felt steady enough to walk. Genevieve felt strange standing on solid ground again. She pushed a hand through her tangled mass of curls and stared up at the sky. So what do you think? Finn asked. She turned back to him and felt a smile pulling at her face. I don't have the words. That was amazing. Thank you. Finn smiled and nodded. A small dose of freedom. This trip was free, but next time I'm charging. Genevieve huffed a laugh and tried to fix her hair. And what payment would you require? His eyes narrowed. I'm still deciding. Flirtatious to a fault. She pursed her lips and gave up on her hair, unsure how to reply. Well, Finn sighed. Let me walk you home. I've got to go to the arena. Genevieve's heart leaped. The male shockjaw. Can I come with you? He paused, chewing his inner cheek. I think, he said carefully, that you've probably had enough adventure for one day. She blinked. Didn't you just tell me an hour ago to take a chance? Yes, but I don't want you going and getting yourself into trouble. I told your parents I wouldn't get any ideas with you and him, and I plan to keep my word on it. So I'll stay in the stands while you feed him. Genevieve raised her chin. Finn crossed his arms. You and I both know that he won't take food from me if he sees you. Exactly, Genevieve argued. So I should be there. Not without your parents' permission. Now who's going back and forth? Genevieve muttered. He sighed, pausing to look at Zap. I get it. Trust me, I get it. But unfortunately for you, my days of rebellion are long since past. Besides, you just had your first flight, that's exhausting enough. Talk to your parents about the shockjaw, but for now, I think you should rest. Genevieve wanted to argue further but refrained. He had a valid point, and now that he'd pointed it out, she was exhausted. Her muscles were a mix of stiff and feeling rubbery, especially her arms and hands from clenching them. Fine. With a bemused smile, Finn ushered her toward the village, Zap on their heels. Genevieve briefly wondered if she would tell her family about the flight. What would they say? Would they be upset? They hadn't made Finn promise anything about flying in general, so they couldn't be mad about it, right? Maybe they were just like her and hadn't anticipated it actually happening. She withheld a sigh as they found a well-worn path that led to the main street. Now that she'd actually flown, her hunger had doubled. Admitting to Finn what she wanted and then going on that crazy, amazing, beautiful flight with him, the thought of things returning to normal now seemed almost impossible. And the male shockjaw, she'd fed him yesterday. Thoughts and ideas collided in her mind. The possibility of training him seemed so strong, almost like it was meant to be. She fought to keep the excitement off her face. She didn't want Finn guessing her thoughts. At last they came upon her house. She fiddled with the brass buttons on her coat before meeting his eyes. Thank you again. That was the craziest, most amazing thing I've ever done. Well, to be honest, you told me what you wanted, Finn said. You made the decision. I was merely a means to an end, what with my convenient mode of transportation on hand. Zap's tongue lolled past her lips as she panted nearby. Right, Genevieve smiled. Well, all the same, thank you. I had a lot of fun today. Yeah, and thanks for showing me your favorite places. Now I know where to place the best pranks. Oh, you'd better not. Genevieve stated firmly, ignoring his laugh. Kidding. I learned a long time ago not to prank a girl's favorite places of relaxation. Rolling her eyes, Genevieve shook her head. Poor Adriana. Poor Adriana. If I'm the one who had to alter my ways, that means she won. Genevieve laughed and pushed his arm. Drama queen. I don't lose very often, so it's a serious complaint. Truly devastating. But anyway, Genevieve sighed. The day had been long and fun, and she'd learned so many things. About him, about flying, about herself. Exhaustion hit her like a ton of bricks and she nodded toward the house. She still needed to eat dinner and maybe she'd get a relaxing bath in before going to sleep. I should head in. I'll see you tomorrow, Finn. Yes. Night. General Finn turned and climbed into the saddle once more, winking at her briefly before Zap launched into the air. She watched them go until they disappeared into the night sky, now a deep blue. Stars twinkled overhead and she stared at them, amazed that only a short while ago she'd been close enough to almost touch them. A light wind picked up and she shivered, realizing how cold she was. She turned into the house and was pleased to find it both warm and empty. She grabbed a few buckets, resolving to fill the bath and take a nice long soak. After such a long day of discovery, she deserved it. As she collected the water and carried it up the stairs to the washroom, everything from the day ran through her mind. The clearing, the caves, Finn's sudden bout of panic, the necklace, admitting to him and to herself what she wanted, and flying. Gods, the flying. By the time her family returned home an hour later, she was already lying in bed fast asleep. She neither heard her mother pop to check on her, nor did she hear the clomping footsteps of the young man in the room above her when he turned in for the night. No, she was long gone, her head filled with dreams of blue eyes, dragon scales and the sound of the wind calling her name. Chapter 37, Frostbite. Chapter text. Cliff always wanted to be a prince. Not the suit in shining armor kind of prince who saves the princess from the tower guarded by a dragon, duh, why didn't she just fly away on the dragon, but the chiefly kind that had the house on the top of the hill and whose parents were literally gods who blessed him with proud smiles. He was not worthy to kiss the dirt beneath their feet. Or something. He didn't know for sure, but he liked to imagine that's what Finn thought. Or he should think that anyway. Honestly, the view from the Haddock house to the village was spectacular, with wild forestry at his back, the open skies above, and wide blue ocean ahead. The Mr. and Mrs. Haddock were kind and thoughtful as always, so he assumed Finn had to literally bless the very ground his parents walked on a regular basis. Astrid nearly choked on her toast when he voiced these thoughts aloud. Hiccup himself was hiding a grin while he tinkered with his prosthetic. I think the only ground Finn worships is the place he's standing on. Well, this must be rectified post-haste. The ungrateful little imp. Cliff replied, cutting the crust off his own toast before cramming a piece of bacon in his mouth. The Haddocks ate like kings, because that's what they were. Kings and queens. Gods, the very fact he had the opportunity, no, the blessing to live in their presence, under their very roof. Hiccup, he's going starry-eyed again. Cliff mimicked a sniff and waved at his eyes, pretending to be weepy. I can't help but feel so blessed to be in this moment with you guys. He reached over and took Astrid's hand. She promptly slapped his wrist with her toast, spattering him with melted butter, jelly and crumbs. Ah! Hiccup chuckled and strapped his prosthetic back on, pacing the room to get the feel of it. Cliff didn't much understand the engineering behind the fake leg, but if the chief's pinched brow was any indication, something didn't seem right. Is it off balance? Astrid asked. No, Hiccup said, pushing his weight onto his left side and twisting. He wobbled momentarily and grabbed the nearest chair. I think some of the gears and screws are worn down, so no amount of tightening is going to fix it. I'll have to make new parts. Well, luckily you were already planning. Sure. Hiccup waved his hands and she instantly closed her mouth. Cliff's interest piqued. What were you planning? The chief tapped his nose with a knowing smile and hobbled to the door. I'll be in the barn if anyone needs me. Right-o Chiefo, Cliff chirped, furiously brushing crumbs off his shirt. Fear not, Mama Astrid, I shall sweep. Good, thank you, Astrid said, standing to clear the table. Ah. It was Cliff's turn to slap her wrist down before he snatched her plate and placed it on top of his. I've got kitchen duty, off you get to do whatever it is you do at this hour. Astrid shook her head in amusement as he charged into the kitchen to clean up. He'd done his very best to clean up after himself while living at the Haddocks. Eventually he'd have to figure out where he'd be living next, especially once Finn came home. While he truly looked forward to it, how awesome would it be to literally live with his other bestest bra, he didn't plan to stay here forever. But while he was here, he certainly didn't plan to be a slob. Not that they were neat freaks. The brands, now they were neat freaks. Taryn's mom dusted when there was no dust. At least let it collect with all its friends before breaking up the party. The Haddocks had many random things in many random places, slightly cluttered, lived in. Weapons, notebooks, mementos from their travels and things the twins made when they were little. Even a few pieces of pottery, which he'd discovered upon his first night here that Binnen had made and gifted the Haddocks for Snoggletalk. He was pretty sure Hiccup and Astrid had been a touch nervous for him to come stay with them. They only had their 2 kids after all. Finn and Adriana hadn't had many sleepovers with friends growing up. It made sense for them to be a little nervous at this little arrangement. And despite popular opinion, aka Eric's popular opinion, he could in fact control himself. For example, he did not barge into anyone's bedrooms at any particular given moment because he had no self-control. He most certainly did not plan to do such a thing to the chief and his wife. Eric was just bitter that Cliff had unceremoniously barged in once without knocking. Sure, it had been awkward, but it wasn't Cliff's fault that he hadn't been home minutes prior to know that Eric had just returned from the washroom. Thank the gods Eric still had a towel around his waist at the time, so it could have been a much more embarrassing situation, but his bestest bra could be just as demure as Taryn sometimes. It was like the sky was suddenly crashing in. It had been an honest accident, in no way intentional. Of course Eric didn't believe him. Thus, he'd never let Cliff live it down. Cleaning up the kitchen and putting up the dishes to dry had taken little time, Astrid having slipped out by the time he finished. He hopped up the steps to Adriana's old room, which he'd been staying in, to fetch his coat and gloves. He had perhaps another 20 minutes before he was to meet Taryn at the hatchery. Shoving his grey wool hat over his bush of curls, he briefly wondered how everything was going on Jet. When Hiccup had returned to Burke a few days ago, he'd regaled them with all the tales of training the Jetans. Gods, the Jetans sounded awesome. He couldn't wait to meet them, especially this Genevieve Hiccup had spoken of so fondly. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the way Hiccup talked about her with a slightly mischievous look in his eye made Cliff wonder what ideas he was concocting. Cliff knew to stay away from the chief when he was concocting ideas. The shockjaw though. When he'd told them about the shockjaw and how it had almost impaled Finn, Astrid had promptly punched her husband on the shoulder so hard Cliff had heard the impact of bone on bone, demanding to know why she hadn't been told. Of course it was due to the simple fact that Finn wasn't that hurt and he didn't like being smothered and Hiccup didn't want to embarrass him. Cliff had never known Astrid to be the smothering type, but it was true. He could see in her eyes and in her silence that she missed her son. Cliff tried to keep away the quiet by being chatty and active, but he'd learned quickly that Cliff noise was not the same as Finn noise. It only made her miss him more. 2 more weeks and he'd be back for Snoggletalk. 2 more weeks without Finn. It was definitely strange not having him, Helga and Thorin around, each of whom were the life of the party, the popular cool kids, the daredevils of the group. But at least Eric was back, he reminded himself as he donned his boots and coat, shoving his fingers into fur-lined gloves. Adriana was naturally getting frustrated being cooped up inside the house at all hours of the day, so Cliff made a point to pop in and say hi a few times a day. She appreciated it, especially when he brought her sticky buns. He thought about her pregnancy as he walked back down the stairs and left the Haddock house, briefly waving to the Haddocks as he hopped atop Edna Louise Sacramento III, his grunkle, and they took off to the hatchery to meet Taryn. The last few times he'd seen Adriana he'd noticed something different about her, like she was pregnant and didn't feel fat or ugly or uncomfortable, all her terms, not his. She'd been glowing, he realized with a smile as the hatchery came into view. Perhaps the sickness had finally been wearing off and she felt good and happy and excited to be pregnant. It was almost Snoggletog after all, and she was due in late February. Gods, she'd be having a baby in 2 months. No wonder he'd sometimes catch Eric staring off into space with a momentarily stunned and terrified expression before it would disappear with a blink. They could do this. People had done this since the beginning of time. They'd have help, and day by day, little by little, they'd make it just fine. The force of Edna's wings blew a torrent of snowflakes around the street as they landed, and he slid down, patting his dragon on the side. "Thanks, Edna, I'll be back in a little bit." A certain auburn-haired girl wrapped in a thick red scarf trotted toward him from the hatchery door, and he beamed. "Hey. Good morning." Butte Cliff's comment was cut off when she reached him, pulling him down by the collar to kiss him. His mind instantly turned to jelly, but he recovered quickly, pressing a hand to her lower back. How terribly convenient that it was so cold and windy that he had the opportunity to pull her in and keep her warm. She pulled away and he almost frowned. A bit breathlessly, he said, "Kissing in the cold is a great way to get chapped lips." Taryn laughed and pushed him away, walking toward the door but throwing a cheeky grin over her shoulder. "No one wants chapped lips. If it happens as a result of you kissing me, I'll gladly endure it." "So naughty all of a sudden," Taryn teased, taking his hand and pulling him inside. The scent of dragons and hay hit him like a wall, and it took a few moments of breathing through his mouth to recover. They'd been told that a new brood of baby dragons had hatched yesterday, and being the adventurous couple they were, Taryn insisted they visit. Baby dragons were just as wild and crazy as their fully grown counterparts, just untrained. They didn't listen to anyone. He'd risk the teeth and claws and burns he'd probably acquire if it meant spending the day with Taryn. Indeed, he'd never been bold with girls, and he certainly had never kissed a girl as much as he had Taryn. That is to say, they'd only kissed a handful of times, but he didn't care. Each one was a victory in his arsenal of successes, and Clyde hadn't burned him to the stake yet. It had been such a joy to watch her blossom the last few months. Cliff had to take initiative for a while, leading her into trying new things. Now she came up with the random fun things, sometimes many ideas at one time, to the point of him trying to compete with her for ideas. They were wild and crazy. Just last week he'd actually gotten her to eat one of Gobber's pickled pig hooves. He was still shocked that she'd actually done it, and he loved her for it more and more by the day. Cliff pecked the back of her hand chastely. "What can I say? You have a terrible impression on me. You dare insinuate that it's my fault?" "Well, you did kiss me first, love." Cliff smirked. Taryn grinned, leading the way into one of the pens that housed a purple monstrous nightmare. She huffed at them in greeting and refocused her attention on her 4 new young, who chirped and flapped and spat fire at each other in the middle of the room. They turned when Taryn opened the gate and stepped inside. "Oh, hello there, babies." Taryn cooed, stooping to pick one up when it scrambled to her feet. "Who's a precious baby dragon?" Cliff grinned, leaning against the door as he watched. She was so unbelievably cute and dorky, and she had no idea. Besides, seeing her hold anything small, baby dragon or human baby didn't matter. She'd make a great mom one day. Blinking out of that particular train of thought, Cliff stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her middle and stared into the baby monstrous nightmare's googly eyes. "Hi there." "Ouch." Taryn cackled when he lurched away, grabbing his nose. "That's what happens when you stick your big nose into someone's face." Ow, Cliff whined, cupping his face. "Am I bleeding?" No. Taryn opened her arms and the dragon clumsily flapped toward its mother. She pulled him down by the collar again, and in a flash of excitement, he wondered if she was going to kiss him again. He was only slightly disappointed to remember that he was the tall to her small, so she couldn't properly inspect his nose from his normal height. "Still?" "Nope, looks okay. Just a little red." Okay. Cliff straightened but stayed looking at her. It had been a throwaway line, but he'd made a comment at the wedding that the event had been fun and Finn had replied, "Well, you're the closest one to being married next, Cliffy." He'd forgotten about it for a while, but suddenly it came to his mind. Seeing Eric and Adriana moving into their future, Cliff wondered. Taryn's brows were lifted. "Hello, Earth to Cliff." He jolted. "What? Sorry, what did you say?" She gave him a long-suffering smile. "Are you all right?" "Me? Fine, yeah, I'm fine." "Why?" "Because you're not talking animatedly, and when you do talk you're stumbling." Cliff sniffed, gently prodding his still smarting nose. "Nah, I'm good, just thinking." He gently brushed past her to sit on the floor in front of the baby dragons. He was quickly accosted by a blue and green one, who blew smoke rings into his face. Taryn took a seat across from him and picked up a red one, scratching its back and making it coo happily. "Okay, so, hypothetically," Cliff asked suddenly. "In a dating situation, how long would you want to date before you got married?" Taryn's hand froze and her eyes shot to his. "Define hypothetically." He shrugged, waving away the smoke clogging his nose. "I don't know, I guess some people have things like that already decided before they date. Some people like Eric and Adriana had to be a bit more spontaneous out of necessity. Me, I always figured I'd cross that bridge when I come to it. So what do you think?" She took a deep breath. "Well, my parents being so traditional, they've mostly been the ones steering the ship most of my life." "They've let go of the rudder though," Cliff replied. "So what are your thoughts? Or do you not know yet? If not, it's fine, you can always bring it up again later." "I'm just wondering." Taryn pet the red dragon curled up in her lap, purring softly as it dozed. Her brown eyes were fixed on the floor as she thought, Cliff's heart thumping as he waited. The blue and green monstrous nightmare crawled up his chest and gazed at the door, its claws digging into his shoulder. "I'll get back to you on that, I think," Taryn said finally. "Because obviously this would be referring to us, not a hypothetical." "Right." She smiled teasingly. Cliff exhaled a small laugh, suddenly finding the floor more interesting. "Yeah. I'll think about it and let you know," she said. Carefully, she asked, "How long do you want to date before you get married?" He pursed his lips. "I don't know. Maybe a year. Maybe a little longer. There's no reason to rush, but I figure if it gets to a point of knowing that that's the person I want to spend my life with, and they reciprocate that, why wait?" Taryn nodded. "I agree." Something stirred in his chest at that. Hope, perhaps. He didn't press the topic though, and neither did Taryn. He'd let her think about it and get back to him in her own time. Not that he was necessarily thinking about marrying her anytime soon. That was a huge commitment, so large and scary and life-altering. He was spontaneous about most things, but that was certainly not one of them. Still, he couldn't help but wonder about the future. Where they might be in a year. In 2 years. 3. 5. 10. Cliff gulped. There was too many serious thoughts going through his brain right now. Baby dragons were cute, but they needed something more random, more spontaneous, more daring. What would Finn do? PFT, if Finn were here he'd probably bribe them into training somehow or learning forge work, which sounded both painful and monotonous. Or maybe he'd convince them to strap themselves onto Edna's back and learn how to dive into the icy-cold ocean like him and Zap. Wait. Cliff blinked, an idea forming in his mind. He felt a smile pulling at his face as he considered the possibility. Oh, if her parents found out, heck if his parents, both Smedley and Haddocks, found out, they'd be most upset, but that was half the fun, right? "Oh no, what are you planning?" Cliff scrambled off the floor without preamble, the baby dragon diving off his shoulder with a squeak. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet, quickly dragging her back down the hallway. "Cliff, where are we going?" "Baby dragons." "There are always baby dragons, Taryn." "But springtime looms." "What?" "Precisely. What are you talking about?" Her long-suffering sigh was laced with amusement. He paused at the door and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Taryn, I have a job for you. It's very important because I have a spontaneous idea. Are you ready to embark?" Would you just spit it out? Taryn demanded. Go home, put your swimsuit on, and meet me at the docks. Taryn stared. What? Go home. I got that part. Put your swimsuit on and yes, the other I meant over top of that so you don't freeze, and meet me at the docks. Why? If I told you you wouldn't do it. Oh well, that's comforting. Come now, Miss Brand. Cliff crossed his arms. Be a little spontaneous. You want me to put on my bathing suit in the dead of winter? Yup. See you in 10 minutes. With that, he shoved out the door and ran headlong into the snowy street, calling for Edna. Taryn's confused laugh disappeared into the tundra, but he knew that the longer they stood and debated what he was planning, heck, he'd even bow out gracefully while he still had the dignity. Luckily both the Haddocks were out of the house when he arrived. It took some digging in his dresser to find his trunks and some warmer layers. He quickly changed and bundled back up, wondering just what he was getting them into with this new idea. He was excited though. Just the idea of telling Taryn in 10 minutes what they were about to do was enough to make him cackle madly as he pulled his boots back on. He grabbed 2 bags and stuffed as many towels and blankets into them as he could before charging back out the door. He was hot underneath all the layers as he sprinted through the village and finally arrived at the docks, his breath like daggers in his throat. Taryn arrived a few minutes later wearing her normal winter gear, but he knew by the distrusting look in her eyes that she wore her swimsuit beneath them. Okay, I'm here. Now what, oh spontaneous one? Cliff held out a hand and led her to the edge of the docks that dropped off into the sand. He led her to the oasis, their teeth chattering with the wind that howled off the ocean. With the lack of buildings and cover out here, he began to consider the wisdom in doing this. But he wasn't going to back down now, they had to see it through. Taryn stared up at the black rock when they arrived. What are we doing here, Cliff? Come on. Cliff scrambled up and held out a hand. She stared at his hand for a heartbeat longer than she usually did, but finally took it, climbing up beside him. They slipped into the oasis with a sigh, the curving lip of the rock thankfully blocking some of the wind that now whistled over their heads. Okay, Cliff said, rubbing his hands together quickly. His heart began to pound in his chest in anticipation of what he was about to tell her. What he was about to do. So here's what I'm thinking. Taryn merely lifted a brow, unamused thus far. I had a great Uncle Fritz. Oh gods, not another crazy story about great Uncle Fritz. I haven't even told you that many stories about him. He was the nutjob that thought the earth was round, Cliff. He disappeared 30 years ago. Your dad even said he fell off the edge of the world. You never even met the man. Finn never met his uncle Fearless Finn, and yet that's what they named him. Anyway, that's besides the point, Cliff said, interrupting her before she could continue her annoyed tirade. The sooner they did this the better. Uncle Fritz supposedly had a best friend who would do this thing each winter that was tradition, and he'd make Fritz do it with him. It was a tradition among best mates or something. I'm not your mate, Taryn said. I'm your girlfriend. Yes, I know that, but listen. Cliff wrapped an arm around her shoulders and tucked her in close. We've still got a while to go before it's spring, and I just think we should take advantage of the time to go polar bear diving before we lose the chance. If we don't do it now, we'll have to wait until next. Where are you, Taryn? Cliff blinked in shock as Taryn shoved out of his arms and scrambled up the incline, panting. There is no way in hell, Cliff Smedley, if you think I'm going swimming in ice-cold water. It's not swimming. Cliff grabbed her around the waist without much effort and pulled her away. She squealed indignantly and he held on tight, laughing at her struggles. You dive in and you get back out. No harm done. No harm done. Taryn demanded. Put me down. All right, Cliff set her down gently and she whipped around. We'll catch our death. Actually, studies show that people don't get sick from being cold, they get sick from bugs. Have you ever seen the way flies rub their little hands together when they scheming and plotting the death of all human existence? Cliff. Oh come on, it'll be over in a minute. Cliff begged. Sure, it will be cold, but we'll hop out and throw our warm clothes back on and run home for a hot bath. We're not going to get sick. You do realize that if my parents find out about this they'd be furious. You said the same thing when I climbed the house to kiss you goodnight for your birthday and I survived that. If Alton hadn't distracted them, they would have found out. I thought you broke your back when you fell. Taryn, Cliff said calmly, crossing his arms. You're overreacting. Taryn huffed and clutched her arms to herself, staring at the pool of water. Cliff realized quickly that they'd have to wade a little deeper to be able to immerse themselves. They had to do it right, okay, but the longer they stood out here debating, the less of a chance they had of doing it. I don't like cold water, Taryn whined. It will be good for the soul. Consider it a cleansing. How about I shove you in and leave you to freeze? Cliff gasped, throwing a mocking hand to his chest. You'd leave me alone. What if I needed rescuing? Why don't we go back to the Great Hall? Taryn begged. I'll ask Astrid to make Yarnock, I'll do whatever spontaneous thing you want, but don't make me do this. Those were the wrong words to say and she knew it, too. Now they were definitely doing it. Victory was imminent. Cliff smirked and began pulling off his coat and gloves. Taryn watched with gradually widening eyes as he removed his warm clothing to reveal his swimming trunks and a long-sleeved shirt, the latter of which he'd removed when the time to go in the water came. But standing in summer clothes without socks or shoes on in this frigid weather, his teeth were quickly chattering. Taryn simpered. Cliff. Not pipe, it's hap ppenr. Happening. He shivered. He could do this. He could do this. Why? There are so many. Taryn, the longer you argue the longer I have to stand here in this improper alignment waiting for you to stop being a chicken. Let's go. But I don't. Taryn stared at the water with a grimace, but there, that small smile pulling at the edge of her mouth. Oh, she wanted to, deep down she knew she did. Think of the children, Taryn. Cliff stated, her brown eyes shooting back to his. Think of all the crazy stories we'll tell the children someday. Even in the cold, her cheeks warmed in an endearing blush and she laughed, looking down at her boots. She bit her lip, glancing back at the water with a final look of despair. Then she closed her eyes and huffed before toeing off her boots. I hate you. Cliff laughed and jumped up and down to get the blood moving and ward off the cold. Another minute and they'd be doing it. They could do this. This was his idea, he could do this. He looked away to offer Taryn some privacy while she quickly and clumsily derobed. He knew her swimsuit to be more demure than many of the other girls, which he didn't mind so much. Soon she stood beside him, teeth chattering and goosebumps speckling her arms. Cliff turned and pulled the towels and blankets out of the bags, setting them down at a close distance. Finally, he pulled off his long-sleeved shirt and shook off a shiver. Oh gods. We could always. Nope. Cliff whipped around and grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the edge of the water. They stopped mere inches from where the edge of the water rested. There were no animals or creatures to be seen in the pool from what he could see. Hopefully they could make this as quick and painless as possible. We've already come this far. Might as well get it done and over with. I still have half a mind to shove you in and leave you here, Taryn said, shaking. Cliff wrapped an arm around her back and rubbed it quickly. Okay. Let's do this. We can do this. He gripped Taryn's hand and they paused. Cliff kept counting down to the 3 in his head, but every time he got to 3, he froze. After nearly a minute, it was the sound of Taryn's whimper that made him surge forward. 3. Taryn screamed as he dragged her forward, but she surprisingly kept pace with him as they leaped forward and plunged into the icy depths. The sensation of stabbing knives prickled his calves, his thighs, his stomach. Cliff panted through his teeth, keeping a tight hold on Taryn's hand until they stopped. Her pants were high-pitched and tense. Okay. Now we go under. Cliff panted. What? Taryn squeaked. Cliff held his breath and plunged downward, the stabbing and prickling sensation taking over his bones, stealing away his very breath. The cold was so bitter and fierce, he inhaled on instinct, swallowing a mouthful of water. He surged upward, hacking, quickly dislodging the water from his throat, which now burned. Sputtering and trembling, he shook the water from his eyes. It was then that he realized he was alone. Taryn. She was already scrambling for the shore, gasping with the cold. He struggled after her, barely able to pull himself back onto shore. His limbs were heavy and frigid. He'd never known that such a cold was fathomable, and his hands shook so badly he could barely grab a towel. Taryn bundled inside a fur blanket and bit out, "I see, can't he believe you went under." Cliff coughed, toweling himself off as fast as possible and yanking his shirts back on. "We've got to bundle and get back to our houses." Taryn shook her head. "If I go home like this they'll know." He finished pulling on the last of his clothes and lunged for her. "Taryn, put your stuff back on and let's go. It was fun and we did it, but now it's time to go, okay?" He tried for a grin but his teeth were chattering. Taryn nodded and complied. He helped her into her coat once her other items were back on, and they struggled tying their boots off for a minute. Cliff put his hat on her head even though his hair was wet. She frowned and he insisted, not willing to risk her getting sick. Yeah, perhaps this hadn't been one of his wiser ideas. They scrambled back up the incline and hurtled for the shore, so cold it hurt to move. Cliff felt his skin freeze beneath his clothes, especially with the wet shorts beneath his trousers. His hair began to ice over and he coughed continually from the salt water burning his lungs. "Are you all right?" Taryn asked. Cliff nodded. Swallowed water. "I'll be all right." They made it back to the docks, the running helping to warm them up a little. They re-entered the village and paused in the middle of the street, Taryn chewing her lip nervously. "I'll be lucky if my parents aren't home." "Keep my hat," Cliff said, warding off another shiver. "You don't even look wet, just a little blue." "Tell them we took a long walk, which isn't a lie." Taryn gave him a worried look. "Cliff, that was really stupid, you don't look good." "Yeah, I know, so kiss me goodbye so I can go take a hot bath." She grinned briefly and complied. Despite what he expected, her lips were cold and chapped, but it still warmed his soul. "I do love a good dippy smile on you," Taryn whispered. "Go home quickly now, don't dilly-dally." Cliff nodded. "You too, Taryn. Love you." She grinned and ran down the street toward her house. As long as her parents didn't look too closely and as long as her clothing didn't drip any puddles where she stood, they shouldn't notice. She'd be okay. Him, on the other hand. The coughing up a lung didn't stop as he stumbled back to the Haddock's house. Why hadn't he brought Edna along? He never thought logically when he got excited about things, now he was paying the price. He briefly considered crashing at his parents' house but he had no clothing to change into. He'd have to wait until his clothes dried and that simply wouldn't do. Plus he'd likely have to explain to his parents what had happened and he really didn't want that. It took some time but he was relieved when he opened the Haddock's door. A blast of hot air from the fireplace hit him square in the face and he moaned, nearly sticking his hands into the fire. "Cold out, isn't it?" Hiccup's voice asked from somewhere to his right. He was so cold and stiff he almost couldn't think straight. Cliff barely managed to look at the dining table to see the chief sitting there with some notebooks and papers strewn about. "That's why I'm home today. My leg can't take the cold front that's coming in right now." Cliff wanted to say but all that came out was a dry rasp that sent him straight into a sharp coughing fit. "Whoa, are you all right?" Hiccup asked, standing up with a look of concern. "I'm okay," Cliff rasped and tried clearing his throat, which was parched and scratchy. It sounded worse than it was. It didn't hurt, per se, but his voice was definitely going out. "I'm gonna." He pointed to the washroom with a tired smile and Hiccup merely nodded. If he'd been thinking clearly, he would have just gone straight to the washroom to begin with. That's what Finn would have done. As it was, when he disappeared in the washroom, Cliff did not notice the chief's lingering stare at the large puddle of water that had formed right where he'd been standing. The Jatan town hall buzzed with mirth. A comfortable warmth spread from the fires, warming the people from the blustery winds outside. With the smell of lamb roasting on a spit and freshly baked rolls and potatoes, the Jatans cackled and sang bawdy tunes, painfully off-key. Genevieve found herself smiling at a group of old men singing merrily from across the room, a few of their dragons bobbing their heads with the off-kilter beat. Who knew that dragons loved music? Tuesdays were always her favorite. It had always been a day for music in the hall, people volunteering to sing or play their instruments. Soloists, choral groups and dancing were the most popular. Once in a while, art of a different form would be displayed, like paintings, carvings, and pottery. The Jatans took pride in their talents. Not to show off but to share a common bond. She wouldn't be singing tonight, however. It was just as well, she wasn't in the mood for performing. Thuggery and Hannah and a few of their friends would likely bring out their instruments in a little while, if her brother's endless prattling that morning was any indicator. Genevieve's heart simply wasn't in the music. Since going on that flight with Finn 3 days ago, she'd found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything. Errands, cleaning, lessons, even singing at the elders' home, she kept finding herself staring off into space, her head in the clouds. She'd half been tempted to volunteer to help Thuggery muck out the horse stalls just to put her feet back on the ground. Thoughts and questions kept swirling in her mind about flying and dragons, but she refrained from seeking Finn out. Perhaps he had a point, even if he'd just been teasing her. She didn't need to be on his heels constantly asking questions. It didn't help that they'd had barely spoken 2 words since the flight. To be fair, she hadn't seen much of him. He'd spent the better part of the last few days at the arena, leaving at the crack of dawn and arriving late into the night. Honestly, she wondered how anyone could have so much energy and not collapse. He seemed to be wide awake now though, even after another long day of training. He was talking animatedly with a few teenagers. She couldn't hear their conversation from the column she leaned against, nursing her mug of strong tea and lemon. She debated joining them when Brenna, the cute brunette beside him, rested her hand on his arm and he gave her a brief crooked smile. Heart shuddering, Genevieve looked away, trying to ignore the pang of jealousy. Maybe he really was like every other boy. Maybe that flight hadn't meant much to him, other than to give her the opportunity to choose something new for herself. She, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about it. The things they'd shared and done together that day. Maybe she had been too nosy after all. Had he not spoken to her the last few days because she had been too much to handle? The cave and flight aside, he'd been fun and witty and even a little flirty throughout the day. He seemed like a genuinely nice guy, but, hopefully he didn't flirt with every girl like that. She didn't like to be jerked around. But no, the way he'd looked at her in the caves once she'd finished singing, the daring smirk on his face when challenging her to make a decision right before that flight. He couldn't really dislike her presence. Right. Regardless, he had to know she was standing here. Disinterested in the music and tired of picking at her food, she'd taken up her vigil at the column nearly 15 minutes ago. She wasn't staring at him or waiting for him necessarily. No, she was simply torn between having self-control and wanting to shove the starry-eyed Brenna off her perch and claim her seat. After all, she hadn't trained in the ring with him, had she? She hadn't spent an entire day with him. She hadn't gone on an hours-long flight on his dragon, just the 2 of them, no one else around to witness her first dose of freedom. She hadn't pressed her body so close to his that she could smell the scent of leather and cedar on his skin. No, none of those things had happened with Brenna. Yet Genevieve was the one standing across the room, watching Brenna's attempts at flattery. As if she saw past the title and the riding leathers and instead saw the boy he really was. Did she even know anything about him? Genevieve certainly knew more than she did, she was positive. Realizing her fingers were clamped on the mug, Genevieve exhaled through her nose slowly and forced her hands to relax. Brenna did have bravery on her side, she'd give her that. While Genevieve might have no qualms asking questions, she certainly wasn't the type of girl to just start touching a boy she found attractive. No, she was too demure for that. And besides, how would Finn react? If he truly didn't see her as more than a new friend, the retired chief's youngest daughter, what kind of uncomfortable position would that put him in if she was suddenly coming on to him? The tea in her stomach turned to lead at the thought. You keep scowling into that mug of tea and it might explode. Genevieve blinked in surprise when Helga appeared at her side, slurping her own mug of ale. She forced her expression into neutrality and nodded to the girl's wrapped arm. What happened there? A monstrous nightmare next door got a little testy. Helga rotated her wrist and hid a wince. Nothing I can't handle. I can imagine. Genevieve replied, perhaps a bit dryly. Helga looked her up and down, surveying her body language, her barely restrained frown. What's eating you? Nothing. Helga snorted. Please. I know a face mooning over fearless Finn when I see one. Genevieve whipped her gaze to the other blonde. Is it that obvious? No, I just know Finn well enough to know which girls suit his fancy and vice versa. Deflating, Genevieve sighed and sipped her tea. Well, clearly he's occupied with Brenna. Helga tried to hide her knowing smile by sipping her ale, but Genevieve knew better. She should resist. She shouldn't ask, but that infernal smirk and that stupid boy still hadn't looked at her. All right, what? Genevieve demanded. Helga smirked victoriously. Finn doesn't like brunettes. But he'll flirt with them. He's not flirting with her. No. Helga withheld a sigh,